Dorian Vexley's boots hit the floor of the Red Willow Stockmen's Club like he owned the building, because for most purposes, he did. He dropped a folded paper on the table in front of 3 ranchers who'd been waiting on his word before they made any decisions about anything. "Wrenford woman's finished," he said, not sitting down, not offering pleasantries. "I've already filed the debt claims. By spring, Goldenbriar goes to auction, and I expect every one of you to stay out of my way while it does." One of the ranchers started to ask a question. Dorian picked up his whiskey, walked to the window, and looked out at the frozen street like the conversation was already over. Nobody asked again. If you've ever watched a powerful man decide a woman's fate before she even knew she was being targeted, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss what happens next. Hit the like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it actually started. The fence wasn't Hollis Fenwick's problem. He knew that. He'd been telling himself that since he spotted the gap in the split rail line running along the north edge of the Wrenford property, cattle moving toward it with the slow, dumb confidence of animals that had found an opportunity and were not going to waste it, he pulled the wagon to a stop. The wind off the mountains had teeth in it by that hour, somewhere in the low 20s and dropping, and the sky to the northwest had that flat, colorless look that people who'd spent enough winters in Montana learned to take seriously. Papa. Tobin's voice from the wagon bed, 11 years old and already with that habit of watching his father's face before deciding how worried to be. "Are we stopping?" "For a little while." "How little?" Hollis didn't answer right away. He was watching the cattle 7 head, maybe 8, nosing toward the gap in the fence with increasing interest. The Wrenford brand was visible on the nearest one. He'd seen that brand on fence posts and water troughs for the last 3 miles, which meant this was significant property, and those were significant animals, and whoever owned them would not appreciate losing them to a November night. He set the brake, climbed down. "Stay in the wagon," he said. "Papa, Maisie's cold. I know she is. Wrap the blanket around her and stay put." He heard Tobin shift, heard the smaller sound of Maisie rearranging herself against her brother 7 years old, and she'd stopped complaining about the cold 2 days ago, which was either because she'd gotten used to it or because she'd figured out that complaining didn't make it warmer. Both possibilities worried him. The fence wasn't his problem, but the cattle moving through it would become someone's problem by morning, and Hollis had been raised by a man who believed that you fixed what was in front of you even when it wasn't yours to fix. He pulled tools from the back of the wagon. The work wasn't complicated. 2 rails snapped at the post, one post leaning at an angle that suggested the ground had heaved during an earlier freeze. He worked by the failing light, hands going numb despite his gloves, and got the rails reattached with wire and a replacement post he trimmed from a fallen branch nearby. It wasn't perfect. Nothing he'd done lately was perfect. But the cattle turned back, and the gap was closed, and Hollis put his tools away and tried to calculate whether they had enough money to make it to the next town with a boarding house. They didn't. Not really. He stood there for a moment with that knowledge sitting on his chest like a stone, looking at the wagon where his children were huddled under a blanket that wasn't thick enough for Montana in November. And he thought about everything that had gone wrong over the past 4 years and how none of it had been survivable except that they'd survived it anyway. And he thought, one more day. We just have to find something for one more day. "What are you doing on my property?" The voice came from behind him, clear and sharp and carrying no uncertainty about who held authority in this exchange. He turned. The woman on horseback was not what he expected, though he'd have been hard-pressed to say afterward exactly what he had expected. She was dressed for the cold in a heavy wool coat with the collar turned up, and she held her horse with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been riding since before they could walk. Her expression was not friendly. It was the expression of a woman who'd found someone she didn't recognize on her land at dusk and was waiting to hear a very good explanation. He pulled off his hat. "Ma'am, my name is Hollis Fenwick. I saw your fence was broken and your cattle were getting through, so I repaired it. I'm sorry if I should have asked first." There wasn't anyone to ask. She looked at the fence, then at him, then at the wagon. He saw the moment her eyes found the wagon, not just cataloged it, but actually looked at it, at the shape of 2 children beneath a blanket, at the lame horse in the traces favoring its left foreleg, at the cracked rear wheel that he'd braced with rope and a strip of leather because he didn't have the money to get it properly fixed. Something shifted in her face. Not softness, exactly. More like a reassessment. "You came through from the east?" she said. "Yes, ma'am. Looking for ranch work. Heard there was ranching country further west." "There is. You've got a long way to go yet." She glanced at the lame horse again. "Not with that animal." "I know it." A silence. The wind pushed between them. "How far have you come today?" He didn't want to answer that. He answered it anyway. "Since before sunup." Her jaw tightened slightly. Not in pity. He didn't think it was pity. More like someone adding up numbers and arriving at a sum they found uncomfortable. She looked at the wagon again. "How old are they?" 11 and 7. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Then, have you and the children eaten?" And Hollis Fenwick, who had been careful with his pride, in the way that a man with very little left is always careful with the last things he has, felt something in his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "We've got supplies," he said. "That's not what I asked." He made himself hold her gaze. "No, ma'am, not since this morning." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she turned her horse toward the ranch house, 200 yards back across the frozen field. "Follow me," she said, and didn't wait to see if he would. He stood there for one breath. 2. Then he climbed back up onto the wagon. "Papa," Tobin's voice was careful. "What's happening?" "We're going to supper," Hollis said. He picked up the reins. "Don't make a mess and don't ask for anything. What if they offer? Then say thank you and take what you're given, not what you want." He heard Maisie's voice, small and hopeful. "Will there be bread?" Hollis clicked the horse forward. "I don't know, sweetheart." "I hope there's bread," she said, to no one in particular. "I've been thinking about bread since Tuesday." Her name was Aurelia Wrenford, and the house she led them to was bigger than any building Hollis had slept in since before his own life went wrong. He was careful not to show that it affected him. He'd learned the hard way that wealthy people noticed when the poor were impressed by their things, and that their noticing rarely worked out in the poor person's favor. The hired woman who met them at the back door, Clara, the housekeeper, a solid woman in her 50s who took one look at Maisie's face and said nothing at all, except come in out of that cold, took the children to the kitchen without ceremony, while Hollis saw to the horses in the barn. The Wrenford barn was warm, considerably warmer than the wagon. He spent more time in it than strictly necessary, getting his bearings, reminding himself of the situation. He was a man with $11, a lame horse, a cracked wagon wheel, and 2 children who hadn't eaten since breakfast. He was in the barn of a wealthy widow who'd invited them to supper out of what appeared to be simple human decency, and he needed to be careful not to mistake that decency for anything it wasn't. He was still working that out when Clara appeared in the barn doorway. "Mrs. Wrenford wants you inside. I'll finish with the horses first." "The horses are fine. The children are asking for you." He went inside. The kitchen was large and warm, and smelled like roasting meat and wood smoke and something with cinnamon that he couldn't identify. Tobin was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of something hot, watching everything in the room with the careful attention of a child who has learned that new environments need to be assessed before you relax in them. Maisie was sitting beside Clara on a bench near the stove, and Maisie was. She was eating a heel of bread with butter on it, slowly, with the total concentration of someone who has decided that nothing else in the world exists except this piece of bread. Hollis watched his daughter eat bread for a moment. He made himself look away before she caught him at it. Aurelia Wrenford was standing near the kitchen window. She'd taken off the heavy coat, and she was wearing a dark dress that hadn't been bought at a general store. She looked like what she was, a woman who had money and was used to having it. But she was watching Maisie eat bread with an expression that was harder to read than wealth. "Your daughter," she said, when she noticed him in the doorway. "Maisie." "Yes." She told Clara she's been thinking about bread since Tuesday. She mentioned that. A slight pause. "It's Thursday." "Yes, ma'am." He watched her absorb that. To her credit, she didn't pursue it. She simply said, "Supper will be ready in half an hour. You're welcome to wash up. There's a room off the hall Clara will show you. Mrs. Wrenford." He kept his voice level. "I don't want to put you out. If there's work I can do to cover the meal, I'd be grateful for the chance to do it. I fixed your fence, but I'd want you to know the offer is open for other work." "You fix my fence," she said, without being asked. "In the dark? In this cold?" Your horse is lame and your wheel needs replacing, and your children haven't eaten since morning. She looked at him directly. Let me feed you. That's all this is. He held her gaze. I don't like accepting charity. Neither did my husband, she said. He spent most of our early years finding elaborate ways to call it something else. Work trade, barter, arrangements of mutual benefit. Something moved across her face. Just come to supper, Mr. Fenwick. He came to supper. The dining room table was the length of a church pew and set for 6 people habitually, though Aurelia ate alone most nights. Clara brought out a roast and potatoes and gravy, and 2 kinds of bread, and a dish of preserved green beans, and Hollis watched his children's faces do the arithmetic of plenty and managed barely, not to let his own face do the same. Tobin remembered his manners. He sat up straight and said please and thank you at the right moments and ate with deliberate restraint, which was its own kind of heartbreak. Maisie had no such restraint, but she had charm, which served her better. She ate her supper with complete focused joy, and then looked up at Aurelia with her napkin tucked under her chin and said, This is the best food I ever had. Did you make it? Clara made it. It's wonderful. Does Clara know it's wonderful? I'll tell her you said so. You should tell her she's very talented. Maisie considered this. My papa's also a good cook, but we don't have as much to work with. Hollis said, Maisie, I'm just saying. Aurelia, to her credit, didn't smile in a way that made Hollis feel pitied. She just said, What does your father make? Beans. Mostly. Biscuits when we have flour. Sometimes salt pork. Maisie thought about it. He made eggs once. Those all sound like good meals. They are, Maisie said, with absolute sincerity, that somehow hurt more than complaint would have. Papa always finds us food. The table was quiet for a moment. How long have you been traveling? Aurelia asked Hollis. 5 weeks. He cut his meat carefully. We came from eastern Montana. Had worked there on a sheep operation until the owner sold the land. And before that, he paused. Horse farming. My family's place back in Wyoming. Drought hit hard in '85, and then the bank, he stopped. It doesn't matter. I'm sorry, she said, and she sounded like she meant it, which he hadn't expected. Don't be. We manage. I can see that you do. She glanced at Tobin, who had carefully arranged his fork on the edge of his plate in what Hollis recognized as his son's method of slowing himself down, so he didn't eat too fast and embarrass himself. Your son has good manners. His mother, he stopped again. Reset. He's a good boy. Aurelia didn't pursue that particular thread either. She simply said, I have work if you're interested in hearing about it. Real work, not charity. My foreman tells me we have 6 horses that aren't being properly handled and about 40 yards of fence line on the south pasture that needs replacing before the snow comes in hard. Hollis set down his knife. What's the pay? $50 a day plus board in the bunkhouse. If you'd rather have a cottage, there's a small one on the east side of the property, used to be the groundskeeper's. Then I'd take 50 cents off the daily rate for rent. He thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. When can I start? You're already eating supper on my property, she said. I suppose that's a start. Tobin looked up from his plate with an expression Hollis hadn't seen on his son's face in almost a year. Not joy exactly. More like relief so profound it had to look like something else to be bearable. Hollis said, All right, Mrs. Wrenford. Aurelia, she said. All right, Mrs. Wrenford. She let that go. The cottage was small and cold, and smelled like it hadn't been lived in since summer. But Clara had put fresh sheets on the 2 narrow beds, and left a stack of firewood beside the stove. And Hollis got the fire going while helped Maisie with her boots. Papa, Tobin said quietly, once Maisie's eyes had started closing. Is this a good situation? Hollis fed a piece of wood into the stove. I think it might be. The woman seems kind, she does. But nothing, Tobin. Not tonight. He looked at his son, who was 11 years old and worried like a man twice his age. Tonight we're warm and fed, and we have work in the morning. That's enough for tonight. Tobin was quiet for a moment. What happened to Mama could happen again, he said. With someone else being kind, I mean. And then it not being. Tobin, I'm just saying I remember what it was like. I know you remember. Hollis crossed to where his son was sitting and put a hand on the back of his neck. So do I. We're not going to forget it, but we're also not going to assume every person who offers us a meal is working an angle. That's not a way to live. Tobin leaned into his father's hand very slightly, the way he hadn't in a while. Okay, Papa. Get some sleep. He waited until both children were breathing slow and even. Then he sat in the single chair beside the stove and looked at the fire and tried to think clearly about his situation. He was a man who'd learned the hard way that dependence was its own kind of cage. Aurelia Wrenford was a wealthy woman with a generous nature and a house that echoed. Those were not ingredients that added up to simple, but his horse was in a warm barn. His children were in warm beds. The stove was drawing well, and the wind outside had given up trying to find them. He'd figure out the rest of it in the morning. He started before sunrise. Clara found him already in the barn when she came out to check on the horses just after dawn, and from her expression this was not what she'd expected. Most men hired for day work showed up at the time they were told, not 2 hours early. He'd already assessed the 6 neglected horses. 2 of them, a gray gelding, and a spotted mare, had trust issues that were visible from the moment he walked into their stalls. The gelding's eye tracked him with the specific kind of wariness that came from being handled roughly, not from bad temperament. The mare was worse. She shifted weight and pulled back at the sound of a halter before he'd even moved toward her. He spent 40 minutes with the gelding without doing anything at all. Just presence. Just breathing. The gelding's ear, which had been pinned back when he entered the stall, gradually came forward. By the end of 40 minutes, Hollis had laid one hand on the horse's neck without either of them making a sudden movement. That was enough for the first morning. He was working with the mare when Aurelia appeared in the barn doorway. She didn't announce herself. She just stood and watched him work. And he was aware of her watching, but didn't change what he was doing because changing it would mean he was performing, and performance was useless with a frightened horse. After a while, she said, "Tom, my foreman said those 2 couldn't be worked." He was probably right at the time. Hollis didn't look up. Something happened to them. Doesn't matter what. They just need to learn the handling isn't going to hurt them. Takes time. How much time? Depends on the horse. He scratched gently behind the mare's ear. She didn't pull back this time. Weeks, maybe. Could be longer. I won't rush it. Tom said they weren't worth the investment. He did look up then. That gelding's got good bone structure and he's not old. The mare's got a sweet temperament under the fear. Whether they're worth it depends on what you're trying to do with them. Aurelia was quiet for a moment. What would you do with them? Work them slow. Get them handling well. The gelding could be a solid working horse in 2 months if you're patient. The mare, he thought about it. She'd be good with a gentle rider. Not a working animal, but good. I don't need decorative horses, Mr. Fenwick. No, ma'am. But you might need a horse that a 7-year-old could learn to ride without getting hurt. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. He hadn't planned to say that. It had just arrived out of his mouth before he'd thought it through, and he waited for her to be offended. It was presumptuous, assuming her interest in Maisie extended to providing the child a horse. She's been talking about horses since she came in for breakfast, Aurelia said. I know, she talks a lot. I noticed. She told Clara the gray gelding has sad eyes and needs a friend. Hollis turned back to the mare so Aurelia wouldn't see whatever was happening on his face. She's not wrong about the sad eyes. No, Aurelia said. She's not. The foreman's name was Tom Baxter, and Hollis didn't like him within the first 5 minutes of meeting him. He couldn't have said precisely why. It wasn't anything Tom did in that first encounter, exactly. He shook Hollis's hand and introduced himself, and explained the work assignments in a businesslike way that gave no obvious cause for complaint. But there was something in how his eyes moved when Aurelia wasn't watching. Something calculated in the efficiency of his friendliness. Hollis had known men like that. The affability as a surface. The accounting happening underneath it. He kept the observation to himself and went to work. The ranch hands, 6 of them, plus Tom, were a mixed group. A couple were young and still figuring out what they were doing. One, a man named Chet, who was somewhere north of 50, had been at Golden Briar since before Aurelia's husband died, and treated the place with the specific loyalty of someone who'd made a life in its service. The rest were unremarkable, competent, careful around the new man, in the way that working men are careful until they decide whether you're going to be trouble. He was not trouble. He showed up first and left last, and didn't talk more than the work required, and helped where he wasn't asked to without making it a performance. By the end of the second day, Chet had started talking to him like a person instead of a variable. How long you plan on staying? Chet asked him. Evening of day 3, brushing out a bay mare in the adjacent stall. As long as there's work. Mrs. Wrenford said you've got a way with difficult horses. I've got patience with them. It's not complicated. Chet was quiet for a moment. Tom put those 2 in the difficult category and told Mrs. Wrenford they were likely not recoverable, He was pushing to sell them off. Hollis didn't look up from what he was doing. They're not unrecoverable. I know that. Anybody who knows horses knows that. Another pause. Tom mostly knows cattle. Hollis said nothing. Chet said, just so you know the lay of the land. Appreciated. Tobin appeared at the barn before breakfast on day 2, without being asked, and asked Chet whether he could help. Chet looked at the boy for a long moment, taking in the seriousness of his expression. The way he was already dressed for work. The fact that he'd arrived before most of the hired hands, and said, You know anything about horses? My papa knows everything about horses, Tobin said, in the manner of a boy stating a simple fact rather than making a boast. I've been helping since I was little. How little? Tobin thought about it. 6 maybe. I used to bring hay. You can start with hay, Chet said. Tobin brought hay. He also brought water and helped with the morning mucking, and listens carefully to everything Chet told him, and didn't complain once, and was back before breakfast was finished. Hollis watched this from a distance and said nothing about it, because anything he said would have been wrong in one direction or in another. Maisie, for her part, had attached herself to the aged mare in the far stall, a chestnut, with a white blaze and a slight hitch in her step that suggested old joint trouble. A horse that Clara said had been at Golden Briar for 12 years and mostly stood around being useless and eating, and was engaged in one-sided conversations with her at various points throughout the day. The mare appeared to find this arrangement acceptable. On day 4, Aurelia came out to watch Hollis works with the gray gelding. This time, she asked questions and he answered them, and they spent an hour talking about horses, without it being anything other than 2 people talking about horses. And somewhere in the middle of it, the quality of the conversation shifted. Or maybe it was just that he stopped bracing for her to do something that wealthy people sometimes did, which was treat practical knowledge as charming entertainment rather than actual expertise. She didn't do that. She listened like she was storing information. She asked follow-up questions that indicated she'd processed what he said the first time. When she disagreed with something about the gelding's eventual use, she said so plainly and explained her reasoning, and her reasoning wasn't bad. You've worked with horses before, he said at some point. My father had horses. Good ones. She scratched the gelding's nose, and the horse, who'd been gradually allowing her approach over the past few days, let her. I haven't had anyone on this property in years who knew what to actually do with a frightened animal. My husband wasn't interested in horses. Tom prefers to sell anything that doesn't perform. He looked at the gelding's relaxed ear. That's a shame. I know it is. She dropped her hand. I'd forgotten how good it feels to watch an animal remember it's safe. He didn't answer that. He wasn't sure there was anything to answer, but he thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. He found the discrepancy on day 9, entirely by accident. Aurelia had asked him to check the feed invoice from the supplier. She couldn't make sense of the quantities matching what they'd actually received, and Tom was out of reach for the morning, and Hollis had taken the ledger into the barn with decent light and gone through the numbers. He went through them twice. Then he went through them a third time to make sure he wasn't making an error. He set the ledger down on the workbench and looked at the wall for a moment. The invoices showed feed purchases 30% above what the ranch actually held. Either an enormous quantity of feed had disappeared into the air, or someone was billing for product that was never delivered and pocketing the difference. Over 6 months, the number added up to something that wasn't minor. He closed the ledger. He thought about Tom Baxter's eyes moving when Aurelia wasn't watching. He thought about the man's readiness to dismiss horses as not worth recovering. He thought about a lot of things, and none of them arranged themselves into a comfortable shape. He sat there for a long while, thinking about what it meant to bring this to Aurelia's attention. He was 9 days into temporary work at a ranch that wasn't his. He had no standing here, no history, no established trust. He was a wandering cowboy with $11 and 2 children and a lame horse. The moment he pointed a finger at Aurelia Wrenford's foreman, he became the obvious suspect for any misdirection. A hired man protecting himself by accusing the man who'd been here for years. He thought about Maisie asking whether there would be bread. He thought about Tobin getting up before sunrise to carry hay without being asked. He closed the ledger, tucked it under his arm, and went to find Aurelia. She was in the ranch house, going over correspondence at the desk in the front room. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. Mrs. Wrenford, I need to show you something in this ledger. She looked at the book under his arm, then at his face. Whatever she read there made her set down her pen without asking him what it was. Close the door, she said. He did. He put the ledger on the desk and showed her the numbers, the invoiced amounts against the received quantities, the math that only worked if a significant portion of the purchased feed had never actually arrived on her property. She went through the columns herself, twice. When she looked up, her face had gone very still in the way of someone who has just understood something unpleasant. How long, she said. These are the last 6 months. I don't know what's in the earlier records. How much? He'd done the rough math, he told her. Her jaw tightened. Tom has been my foreman for 7 years. Hollis didn't say anything. He handled everything after my husband died. He managed the transition, the accounts, the hands, the inventory. She looked at the numbers again. I trusted his judgment. I know, he kept his voice even. Mrs. Wrenford, I'm aware of how this looks. I've been here 9 days, and I'm telling you, your foreman of 7 years has been stealing from you. You have every right to question my motive. She looked at him. What is your motive? You hired me to do honest work, he said. I can't do honest work and sit on numbers like these. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, he could hear Maisie's voice somewhere in the yard, talking to the chestnut mare in the animated way. She talked to animals when she thought no one was listening. Aurelia looked at the ledger for a long time. I'll need to compare these to the earlier months, she finally said. Yes, ma'am. And I'll need someone to help me do that who knows what they're looking at. He waited. Can you read a financial ledger, Mr. Fenwick? Well enough. She slid the ledger toward him and turned to the stack of older account books on the shelf behind her desk. Then, sit down, she said. This is going to take a while. It took 4 hours. By the end, the number was considerably larger than either of them had initially suspected. Aurelia sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not in grief exactly. More like someone finding their footing after unexpected ground movement. I need to think about how to proceed, she said. I can't confront him without something more concrete than feed invoices. No, Hollis agreed. You'll want to trace the actual delivery records. Check with the supplier directly about what was actually sent versus what was invoiced. That could take weeks. It could. And in the meantime, he's still here. Hollis didn't answer that immediately. He'd been thinking about it for the past 2 hours, turning it from different angles, and none of the angles were comfortable. In the meantime, he said slowly, I'd suggest not letting him know you're looking. She studied him. And I'd suggest not telling anyone else you've found this. Agreed. He stood, including the other hands. I don't know who he talks to. No. She was still looking at him with that assessing quality he'd noticed from the first evening, like she was running calculations he couldn't see. Mr. Fenwick, ma'am, you could have said nothing. 9 days in, stranger on temporary work. You could have looked at those numbers and put the ledger back and gone on with your fence repair. Yes. Why didn't you? He picked up his hat. Because you asked me to check the invoice and I checked it. That's all? He thought about it honestly for a moment. Because you fed my children when I couldn't, he said. And in my experience, the kind of person who does that without making you feel small for needing it. He stopped. They deserve to know when someone's stealing from them. Aurelia Wrenford looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, Mr. Fenwick. He put his hat on and went back out to the horses. But he was aware, walking out into the cold afternoon light, that something had changed between the moment he'd knocked on that door with the ledger under his arm and the moment he'd walked out of it. He just wasn't sure yet what it had changed into. Outside, Maisie was still talking to the old chestnut mare. The mare's head was over the fence rail, and she was listening with her ears forward, and Maisie was telling her something important about the color of the sky. And the mare appeared to find this extremely relevant information. Hollis watched them for a moment. Then he went back to work. The morning after Hollis showed Aurelia the ledger, Tom Baxter came into the barn, while Hollis was working with the gray gelding, and stood in the doorway, with his hands in his coat pockets, and watched for a while without saying anything. Hollis kept working. He didn't look up. Heard you were looking at the feed invoices yesterday, Tom said finally. Mrs. Wrenford asked me to check them. Hollis ran a brush along the gelding's shoulder in slow, even strokes. The horse's ear tracked toward Tom's voice and then back, uncertain. Couldn't make sense of the quantities. Neither could she. Those records go back years. Takes a while to understand how we track things here. A pause. Find anything useful? Hollis looked up then, just briefly, the way a man looks up when he's being polite, rather than when he's actually interested. Nothing I could make heads or tails of. Those early ledgers were a mess. He went back to the horse. told her she'd probably want someone who knows the system better than I do. Tom was quiet for a moment. That'd be me, he said. I set up most of those records after Mr. Wrenford passed. Figured as much. I told her that. Another pause longer this time. Hollis could feel the man calculating behind him. You're good with that horse, Tom said finally. His voice had shifted back to something more ordinary. I'll give you that. He's a good horse under the nerves. Maybe. Tom pushed off the doorframe. Breakfast is up if you want it. He left. Hollis stood very still for a moment after the sound of his boots faded. The gelding nosed at his coat pocket, looking for something that wasn't there. I know, Hollis said to the horse quietly. I know. He went to breakfast. He sat where he always sat, ate what he always ate, said as little as he always said, and watched Tom Baxter talk and laugh with the other hands, with the ease of a man who had decided the new hire was no threat and the morning was going to be fine. He thought, we'll see. Aurelia had spent the night going through the older account books, and she looked like it when she came out to the yard mid-morning. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there the day before, and a set to her mouth that told Hollis she'd found more than she'd been looking for. She didn't approach him directly. She went to the paddock fence and stood there watching the horses, which was something she did regularly. And after a few minutes, he drifted over naturally and leaned on the fence rail beside her, in the way of two people who happened to be looking at the same horses at the same time. Earlier than I thought, she said, without turning her head. How much earlier? At least 18 months, possibly 2 years. She was looking at the spotted mare, who was moving along the fence line in a loose, restless circle. I need to contact the feed supplier directly. I can send a letter, but that takes time. Can you send someone to Billings? I can, but whoever I send, she stopped. I don't know who I can trust right now. Most of the hands have been here longer than you have. Hollis thought about Chet, who'd worked at Golden Briar since before Aurelia's husband died, and spoke about the ranch the way a person spoke about a place they belonged to. Chet Murdoch, he said. She glanced at him. He knows the ranch better than anyone. He's not close with Tom. I've watched them. They're cordial, but there's something between them that's not comfortable. He kept his voice low. And he's the kind of man who wouldn't steal from a widow because he wouldn't be able to sleep afterward. She looked back at the horses. You've known him for 9 days. Yes. And you trust your read on him? He thought about it honestly. I trusted enough to suggest it. You know him longer than I do. You can weight that accordingly. She was quiet for a moment. I'll think about it. That afternoon, Hollis watched her have a long, apparently casual conversation with Chet near the water pump, the kind of conversation that looked like nothing from a distance. He watched Chet's face during it, the attentive stillness of a man being told something significant, the careful way he looked at the ground while he processed it, the slight nod when he'd decided where he stood. The next morning, Chet was gone on a 3-day supply run to Billings. Tom remarked on it at breakfast, and Aurelia said she'd sent him to check on a livestock contact, which was plausible enough that no one questioned it, and the morning moved on. Hollis said nothing and went back to his horses. It was on the 12th day that Dorian Vexley arrived at Golden Briar. Hollis was on the far end of the south pasture replacing fence posts, real work, physical work, the kind that left your shoulders burning by noon, when he heard horses coming up the main road and looked across the field to see a man riding in on a horse that cost more than Hollis had earned in the past 2 years. 2 other men rode behind him, the kind of behind that was less escort and more statement. He went back to the fence post. Not his business. But he watched from a distance because he'd learned a long time ago to watch. The man dismounted in the yard with the ease of someone who'd dismounted in that particular yard before and considered it his right. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, built like a man who'd been powerful in his youth and had stayed mostly powerful out of habit. He wore his coat well, and he knew it. He looked at the house, and then at the barn, and then at the yard with the kind of comprehensive assessment that was less appreciation and more inventory. Aurelia came out to meet him. Their conversation was too far for Hollis to hear, but he could read the shape of it, Dorian Vexley talking and gesturing toward the house, Aurelia's posture indicating polite resistance, Vexley's hands spreading in a gesture that said he was being reasonable and she was being difficult. At some point, Vexley said something that made Aurelia turn her head sharply, and whatever it was, it shifted the entire weight of the conversation. She spoke then brief, firm, and the angle of her body said she was done. Vexley saw Hollis across the field at that moment. He looked at him for a long moment. Just looked. The way a man looks at something he's trying to assess the value of. Then he said something to Aurelia, one more thing, and remounted his horse and rode out with his 2 men behind him. Aurelia stood in the yard for a moment after he was gone. Then she turned and went back inside. That evening she came to the barn, while Hollis was finishing up with the gelding. "How much of that could you see?" she asked. "Enough to know it wasn't a friendly call. Dorian Vexley." She said the name the way you say a name when you want the person you're talking to understand it's significant. "He's been trying to buy Golden Briar for 2 years. He owns the 3 properties east of me, and he wants the water access my land controls." Hollis said nothing. She paused, chose her words. "He's made it clear that he'd prefer to acquire the land through marriage rather than purchase, which he considers a more elegant arrangement. And you've declined." Repeatedly, she folded her arms against the cold. "Today he told me he'd heard I'd hired a new hand. He wanted to know who you were." Hollis looked at her. "What did you tell him? That you were a skilled horseman I'd taken on temporarily?" A pause. "He told me I should be careful about the kind of men who came around widows living alone." The barn was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up. "He said it pleasantly," Aurelia added. "He's very good at saying unpleasant things pleasantly." Hollis set down the brush. "Is he dangerous?" She considered that seriously, which he appreciated. "He's powerful. In this territory, that's usually the same thing." She looked at the gelding. "He didn't get where he is by being careless or patient. Does he know about the missing money?" "He would know what Tom told him." She said it flatly, like she'd already turned that possibility over in her mind and arrived at the same conclusion he was arriving at now. "I don't know the shape of it yet. I'm waiting for Chet to come back from Billings. And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," she said, "I go about my business like everything is normal." She looked at him directly. "That's what I'd ask of you as well." He nodded. Understood. She left. He stood in the barn for a long while after that, listening to the wind and the shifting of horses in their stalls, and he thought about his wagon with its cracked wheel parked behind the cottage, and his lame horse getting better day by day, and his children who were sleeping warm and eating 3 meals. And he thought about how a man in his position should probably be thinking about how soon he could leave. He thought about that. Then he went to check on the spotted mare and put it out of his mind. Maisie named the chestnut mare Pearl. She announced this at supper on the 13th day, with the confidence of someone presenting a decision that had already been made and was not open to amendment. Clara glanced at Aurelia. Aurelia glanced at Hollis. Hollis looked at his daughter. "That's Mrs. Wrenford's horse," he said. "I know, but she doesn't have a name," I asked Mrs. Wrenford. Mrs. Wrenford said she didn't have a name. Aurelia said, "She's been here 12 years, and I've always just called her the old chestnut." Maisie looked at her father with the expression of someone who felt this proved their point. "So she doesn't have a name, and I've been talking to her every day, and she knows my voice now, and she deserves a name." A pause. "Her name is Pearl because of the white on her face." Hollis said, "Maisie, I think Pearl is a fine name," Aurelia said. Maisie sat back with the satisfaction of someone who had anticipated this outcome. Tobin, across the table, had the careful expression of a boy trying not to smile. Hollis ate his supper and said nothing further on the subject of the horse's name, because there was nothing further to say. But that evening, walking back to the cottage, Tobin fell into step beside him and said quietly, "She talks to that horse for an hour every day, Papa." "I know. She told it about Mama." Hollis kept walking. "I know." Tobin was quiet for a moment. Should we be worried about that?" Hollis thought about his daughter, 7 years old, telling her secrets to a horse that would actually stand still and listen. "No," he said. "I don't think so." Chet came back from Billings on the 16th day. Hollis was working with the gray gelding. He had a name now, too, though that was Hollis's private arrangement rather than anything official. When he heard Chet's horse in the yard, and then voices, and then a long silence that had a different quality than the silences that usually followed someone's return from a supply run, he waited. An hour later, Aurelia found him at the water trough. "Walk with me," she said. They walked to the far end of the paddock, out of earshot of the barn and the bunkhouse. "The supplier confirmed it," she said. Chet brought back signed copies of the actual delivery records. Over 20 months, the invoices submitted to Golden Briar's accounts were 40% higher than what was actually delivered. In some months, certain items were billed for entirely feed, equipment that was never sent at all. The number was worse than Hollis had calculated. He'd suspected it might be. Does Chet know who the supplier was sending the overpayment to? Not to who, but he knows how. She stopped walking. The supplier's representative, a man named Griggs, in Billings has been issuing 2 sets of receipts. One that goes to Golden Briar's records, one that goes somewhere else. Chet didn't push too hard, because we didn't want Griggs to know we were looking. Smart. Chet is smart when he needs to be. She looked across the paddock. The problem is that invoices and delivery records are enough to establish theft, but they're not enough to establish who Tom was working with, or whether it goes further than Tom. Hollis thought about Dorian Vexley riding in on his expensive horse and looking at the ranch like he was taking inventory. Cattle, he said. She looked at him. Has your cattle count been audited recently? Not your accounting records. An actual physical count of what's in your pastures versus what the books say you own. A pause. Not since my husband died. He nodded slowly. Might be worth doing. Her jaw tightened again with that specific quality he'd started to recognize. Not anger exactly. More like someone who kept finding the hole deeper than they thought. How long would that take? With enough hands, a few days. But you'd need to do it in a way that doesn't look like you're doing it for that purpose. Which means a general roundup. Winter check on the herd, which is normal practice this time of year. Tom would expect it. He kept his voice neutral. If you trust the men doing the count. I trust Chet. She looked at him. I'm starting to trust you. He didn't say anything to that. I'll talk to Chet, she said. He can organize the count. She started walking back toward the house. Mr. Fenwick, ma'am, whatever we find, whether it's worse than we think or exactly as bad, you need to know that this isn't your problem to carry. You've already done more than anyone could reasonably ask of a man 9 days into temporary work. He thought about the right answer to that. You gave my children a warm place to sleep, he said. Carrying this is the least I can do. She stopped, turned. That's not a debt, Mr. Fenwick. That was just, she seemed to look for the word. Human, I know, he said, but it still matters. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Then she went inside and he went back to the horses. The thing Hollis hadn't accounted for was the talk. It started the way talk always started in small places. Not as a flood, but as water finding its level, seeping in through the gaps. A remark here. A question phrased sideways there. Clara mentioned it first carefully, in the way of a woman who wanted to inform without alarming. People in town are asking about you, she told him one morning when he came in for coffee. Who you are, where you came from. Natural enough, Hollis said. Tom was in Red Willow 2 days ago. She said it while refilling his mug, not looking at him. Had drinks at the cattle exchange with Dorian Vexley's men. He kept his face still. Appreciate you telling me. Thought you should know. She set the coffee pot down. Chet knows too. He came back from Billings different. Different how? Like a man who found out something he wishes he hadn't, but is going to do the right thing with anyway. She went back to the stove and didn't say anything more, and Hollis sat with his coffee and thought about the shape of things. 2 days later he was in Red Willow for supplies. Aurelia had sent him, which was itself a statement, giving him that kind of visible errand, when he heard it directly. He was loading flour into the wagon outside the general store when he heard Vexley's voice behind him. He recognized it before he turned, that particular register of a man used to rooms going quiet when he spoke. He turned. Vexley was standing on the boardwalk with 2 other men ranchers. From the look of them, the kind of men who made decisions over drinks rather than over fences. Fenwick, Vexley said, not a greeting exactly, more like a label. Mr. Vexley, Mrs. Wrenford's new hand. Vexley said it to the men beside him as much as to Hollis, and the way he said it, with that particular curve to his voice, had a shape that Hollis recognized. He was being displayed, examined publicly. How is Golden Briar treating you? Fine, sir. Good work. Glad to hear it. Vexley descended the step onto the street level, which brought him closer, which was the point. Aurelia Wrenford's a generous woman to those who need a hand up. Always has been. Soft-hearted. He said soft-hearted in a way that wasn't a compliment. A hungry man will call any rich woman's table home, I suppose. The 2 ranchers were watching Hollis's face. He made himself smile small, easy, like this was an observation he found mildly amusing rather than what it was. I expect that's true of hungry women, too, if it comes to that. Good afternoon, Mr. Vexley. He loaded the last of the flour. He climbed up onto the wagon. He clicked the horse forward and drove out of Red Willow at a normal pace and didn't let his hands tighten on the reins until he was outside the town limits. He thought about Maisie eating bread on the night they arrived, and the quality of Vexley's was when he said soft-hearted, and he thought, whatever else happens here, I am not going to let my children be part of this man's calculations. He told Aurelia what Vexley had said that evening. He told it plainly, without embellishment, because he thought she had a right to the exact words. She listened. Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said he said that in front of witnesses. 2 ranchers. I didn't know them. He wanted it said in front of witnesses. Her voice was level, but there was something compressed behind it. He's framing a story. A drifter who found a lonely widow. An arrangement that's useful to one party. She looked at the fire in the hearth. He wants people asking questions about your motives before you become a problem to him. Hollis said, I could leave. That would solve the question of my motives. She turned her head. Don't do that, Mrs. Wrenford. Hollis. First time she'd used his given name. She didn't seem to notice. If you leave now, it confirms what he's suggesting. And it leaves me without the only person on this property I can fully trust right now. A pause. Besides, it would upset Maisie terribly. She's already convinced Pearl needs you to check on her daily. He made himself breathe normally. Pearl doesn't need me checking on her. Pearl needs Maisie talking to her. Then stay for Maisie's sake. She said it lightly, but there was something underneath it that wasn't entirely light. He looked at the fire. I'll stay. Thank you. But you should know, he said carefully, that Vexley is not going to stop at talk. If he's been working with Tom, if he's the one behind the missing money and the false debts, then public opinion is probably not the only tool he's using. I know that. You need to think about whether you're prepared for this to get harder before it gets better. She looked at him directly. Are you? It was a fair question. He sat with it honestly for a moment. My children need stability, he said. I've been telling myself that means I should stay clear of situations that could go wrong. He paused. But I've also been telling myself a lot of things over the past 4 years that turned out to be careful thinking dressed up as wisdom, and they mostly just amounted to being too scared to stay somewhere long enough to matter. The fire cracked. Outside the window, the temperature was dropping again. That's an honest answer, Aurelia said. I try to be honest. It's one of the few things I haven't lost. She looked at him for a moment with that quality of attention he'd noticed before. Not romantic, not analytical exactly, but full. Like she was actually seeing the person in front of her rather than the category she'd initially put him in. Tell me about Wyoming, she said, if you want to. He thought about not wanting to. Then he thought that she'd earned something more than official answers. My father had 60 acres east of Laramie, he said. Good land. Not big, but good. We ran horses, quarter horses mostly, some draft crosses. I took it over when he died, which was 80. He paused. My wife, Catherine, she came from a town family. She wasn't unhappy with the life, I don't think. Or I didn't think so then. He stopped. The drought hit in 84 and 85. 2 hard summers. We lost pasture, and then we lost animals, and then we lost ground against the bank. And Catherine, he stopped again. She had family in Denver, a brother with money. She said she was taking Maisie to her mother for the summer while I worked things out. Aurelia said nothing. She didn't come back, Hollis said. Tobin was 10. He understood more than he should have. A long silence. I'm sorry, Aurelia said. I'm not looking for sympathy. I know you're not, she said it quietly. I'm just sorry, because she left her children. He hadn't let himself land on that particular piece of it in a while. Something about the directness of Aurelia saying it. Not Catherine left you, but she left her children moved something in his chest that he generally kept nailed shut. Yes, he said after a moment. She did. Another silence, different from the others. My husband was a good man, Aurelia said eventually. Not a change of subject, something offered in kind. Not a warm man, always. He was better with accounts than with words. But he wasn't honest, and he worked hard, and he never made me feel foolish for caring about things. She paused. When he died, I kept expecting the grief to get smaller. It didn't get smaller. It just got quieter. And then the quiet was its own kind of, she seemed to look for it, its own kind of weight. Hollis nodded. Clara thinks I should have married again by now, Aurelia said. She doesn't say it, but she thinks it. Clara's practical. She is. She also worries. A pause Vexley's been pushing for 2 years. Other men before him. They all frame it as helping me, as protection. Her voice was dry. I don't need protection. I need to not be stolen from. He almost smiled at that. Not quite. That's a reasonable position. It's the only position. She looked at him. Does it seem strange to you? A woman choosing to manage her own property rather than hand it to a husband. He thought about it honestly. No, he said. Seems like the kind of decision a person makes when they know what they've built. She looked at him for a moment. You're going to be very difficult to replace, she said finally. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He picked up his hat. Good night, Mrs. Wrenford. Good night, Hollis. He walked back to the cottage in the dark, in the cold, and he told himself, be careful. And then he told himself, you've been careful for 4 years, and your children have been cold and hungry, so maybe careful isn't the only thing that matters. He lit the lamp in the cottage and checked on Maisie and Tobin, both asleep. He sat at the small table for a while. He thought about Wyoming and Denver and the summer Catherine didn't come back. And then he stopped thinking about that and started thinking about the feed invoices, and Tom Baxter's calculating eyes, and a man in red willow who said soft-hearted like it was an insult. He thought about Aurelia saying, I need to not be stolen from, with the simple weight of someone who had spent 2 years watching powerful men treat her property as theirs to arrange. He thought, not on my watch. And then he thought, you don't have a watch here. You're temporary. And then he thought, then I'll be temporary and still not let it happen. He found the wagon tracks on a Tuesday. He'd been checking the eastern fence line, a regular task that Aurelia had made part of his rotation, when he cut across the lower field and noticed tracks in the frozen mud near the creek that ran along the property's eastern boundary. Wide tracks, wagon tracks, and recent, though recent in frozen ground, could mean 2 days or 2 weeks depending on temperature. He followed them. They ran parallel to the fence line for about 300 yards, then veered south toward a stand of cottonwood trees near the creek bend. In the cottonwood stand, the ground told a story, multiple sets of hoofprints, churned mud, a place where animals had been held. And along the fence line, where the tracks ran closest, a section of fence that had been repaired recently, repaired from the inside. He crouched and looked at the wire. It was newer than the wire on the sections adjacent to it, and the posts had been reset in a way that was competent but quick, the work of someone in a hurry rather than someone taking care. He stood up and looked at the churned ground under the cottonwoods. A lot of cattle had stood here, not briefly long enough to leave deep impressions in the mud. He thought about Aurelia's herd and the audit that Chet was quietly conducting, moving through the back pastures in the guise of a winter health check. He thought about cattle that were on Goldenbrier's books, but not in Goldenbrier's pastures. He thought about a fence that someone had opened from the inside, run animals through, and closed again. He took his time noting the location. Then he rode back to find Chet. Chet listened to him with the stillness of a man who was no longer surprised by bad news, but still had the decency to be troubled by it. Eastern boundary, creek bend, Hollis said. Fresh wire on the fence. Ground's been worked under the cottonwoods. Chet was quiet for a moment. I've been through the east herd numbers twice, he said. I'm showing a difference of 60 head between what the books say we should have and what I can physically account for. 60 head. Hollis said, does Tom do the eastern fence checks? Assigns them to whoever he wants. Chet looked at the ground, usually himself when it's that section. And the cattle drives to market this year? Tom organized them. Chet's voice was getting flat in the way that anger sounded when a man had been sitting with it long enough for it to cool into something harder than heat. He's been at this ranch for 7 years, and I've been here for 12, and I trusted his tallies because he stopped. Because I thought he was what he said he was. Hollis put a hand on the older man's shoulder briefly. You couldn't have known. I should have looked closer. He didn't want anyone looking closer. That's the whole point of it. Chet scrubbed a hand across his jaw. Mrs. Wrenford needs to know. She needs to know the cattle number first. She needs that in writing before we bring her the fence evidence. Hollis thought it through. If we go to her with only the fence tracks, Tom can explain it away. An animal broke through. Fence was repaired. But if we go to her with a documented count showing 60 head missing, combined with falsified invoices and evidence of a breach point, that's a different conversation. Chet looked at him. You think like a man who's dealt with this kind of thing before. Hollis shook his head. I think like a man who lost everything once, because he didn't have the documentation to prove what was happening until it was too late. Chet was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Give me 2 more days on the count. I'll make it clean. 2 days. They went their separate ways. Hollis went back to his horses and went about the rest of the afternoon, with his face giving nothing away, because Tom Baxter was in the yard, and Tom Baxter watched everything And what Tom Baxter saw in Hollis Fenwick's face needed to be nothing more remarkable than a man doing his work. That evening, Tobin came to him while he was splitting wood behind the cottage and stood there waiting, which was his son's way of indicating he had something serious to say. Hollis set down the axe. Talk. One of the younger hands, Denny, told me something. Tobin's voice was careful. He didn't know he was telling me something. He was just talking. He paused. He said Tom's been moving cattle to a holding yard south of Red Willow. He thought it was just a normal drive winter grazing. But Denny said he thought it was strange because Mrs. Wrenford didn't know about it. He heard Tom tell one of the others that Mrs. Wrenford approved it but not to bother her with the details. Hollis looked at his son. 11 years old, standing in the cold, delivering information he'd gathered without being asked because he'd understood it was important. He felt something very complicated move through his chest. You did good, he said. Is it bad? Hollis picked up the axe. It confirmed something we already suspected. Are we going to have to leave? The question landed harder than Tobin probably intended it to. Hollis split a log, set the two pieces aside. Not yet, he said. Don't say anything to Denny or anyone else about what he told you. Act normal. I always act normal. I know you do. He looked at his son. You're a good man, Tobin. Or you're going to be. Tobin's jaw did something complicated, Papa. Go check on your sister. Tobin went. Hollis stood alone in the cold for a while, splitting wood with more force than strictly necessary, and he thought about the holding yard south of Red Willow, and he thought about 60 head of missing cattle, and he thought about the connection between Tom Baxter's 7 years at Golden Briar and Dorian Vexley's 2 years of pressure on Aurelia Wrenford, and he thought, this is bigger than feed invoices. This was always bigger than feed invoices. He thought about leaving. He did. He thought about the wagon and the lame horse, which was walking better now, and the cracked wheel, which he'd repaired with proper materials instead of rope. He thought about how they could go. And then he thought about Aurelia at her desk at 11 o'clock at night, going through account books by lamplight, with the determined focus of a woman who was not going to be beaten by this. And he thought about what that kind of determination deserved from the people around her. He set down the axe. He went inside and told his children good night. And in the morning, before sunrise, he was back in the barn with his horses. The gray gelding who had stopped flinching when he entered the stall. The spotted mare who was learning to trust the sound of his voice. And he worked through the cold hours thinking about what came next, and what he owed, and what he was capable of, and whether capable and owed were enough. He thought they were. They had to be. Chet came back from his second sweep of the east pastures on a Thursday morning with a notebook and an expression that had gone past, troubled into something quieter and more resolved. He found Hollis at the water trough and handed him the notebook without a word. Hollis looked at the numbers. Chet had been methodical section by section, pasture by pasture, tallied against the ranch's official count with the patience of a man who understood that the difference between suspicion and proof was the work you were willing to do between them. 63 head. 63 cattle that Golden Briar's books claimed, but Golden Briar's pastures did not hold. He handed the notebook back. We take this to her today. This afternoon, Chet said. Tom's going to Red Willow this morning. He told me last night's supply run, said he'd be back by supper. Hollis nodded. This afternoon, then. He went back to his horses and worked through the morning with the mechanical focus of a man keeping his hands busy so his mind could stay clear. The gray gelding, he'd started thinking of him as gray, which wasn't a name exactly, but was what happened when you spent enough time with an animal stood quietly, while Hollis worked the brush along his back. And the horse's ease under his hands was the one uncomplicated thing about the morning. At noon, Tobin brought him a plate from the kitchen without being asked. The boy sat on a hay bale while Hollis ate and didn't say anything for a while, which was his son's way of being present without making it a conversation. Denny left this morning, Tobin said eventually. Hollis looked up. Left? Gone. His things from the bunkhouse. Tobin kept his voice steady. Chet said Tom must have let him go. Hollis set down the plate. Denny, the young hand who'd talked too freely about the cattle movement south of Red Willow, was gone the same morning Tom went into town. He thought about that for a moment. Does Chet know you talked to me about what Denny said? No. Keep it that way. Hollis picked up the plate again. And don't talk to any of the other hands about Denny leaving. Tobin nodded, and that was the end of the conversation. But Hollis felt something shift under the morning. Tom was tidying, removing variables. which meant Tom felt something moving toward him and was getting ready. Aurelia listened to them in the front room, him and Chet both. Chet with his notebook and Hollis with the documentation he'd compiled from the feed invoices. And she listened without interrupting, which was something he'd noticed about her. She let information arrive completely before she responded to it. Most people started forming answers halfway through the question. She didn't. When they finished, she sat for a moment looking at Chet's notebook. 63 head, she said. Yes, ma'am, Chet said. Plus the overpayments in feed and equipment. Plus the falsified delivery records. She looked up. And a holding yard south of Red Willow that I knew nothing about. That's what the Denny boy told Tobin, Hollis said carefully. I can't put my name to that directly because I heard it secondhand. But Denny's gone this morning, which tells us Tom knew the boy had said something he shouldn't. She closed the notebook. He's covering his tracks. He went to Red Willow this morning, Chet said. I don't think that's a supply run. No, she was quiet for a moment. Her hands were flat on the desk, and she was looking at something none of them could see. He's going to report to Vexley. Tell him we're getting close. She paused. Which means we have less time than I thought. Hollis said, What do you want to do? She looked at him. What I want to do and what I can do are different questions. She stood up. What I can do is go to the county land office in Red Willow and file a formal complaint of livestock fraud before Tom gets back this afternoon and before Dorian Vexley can arrange whatever he's planning to arrange. Chet said, You'd be going into town while Tom's already there. Yes. She said it simply, I would. Hollis thought about this. Going into Red Willow while Tom was there meant Vexley would know by the end of the day that Aurelia had moved. That was a problem. But not going letting Tom return, letting Vexley have whatever conversation he'd ridden out there to have was a bigger one. I'll drive you, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then get the wagon. They went into Red Willow with Chet's notebook and the invoice documentation wrapped in oilcloth in the wagon bed, and Aurelia sat up on the bench with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap and said very little for the first mile. Then she said, If this goes wrong, if Vexley has more influence over the county officials than I do, this could move against me very quickly. I know. I want you to understand that before we get there. If it goes wrong, everything that follows is going to be harder. He kept his eyes on the road. Everything that follows is already going to be hard. Filing makes it at least go in a direction instead of just getting worse quietly. She was quiet for a moment. My husband would have found a way to handle this privately. He believed in quiet resolution. Was he usually right about that? She considered it honestly. Sometimes. And sometimes things that should have been addressed directly just accumulated. She looked at the road ahead. I've been too patient with Vexley. I kept thinking if I managed him carefully enough, he'd eventually redirect his ambitions somewhere else. Men like Vexley don't redirect, Hollis said. They just find a different angle. No, she said. They don't. Red Willow in late November was pulled into itself against the cold fewer people on the street than summer, the buildings hunched under a gray sky that had been threatening snow since morning. Hollis drove to the county land office and brought the wagon to a stop, and he helped Aurelia down and carried the documentation inside. The county clerk was a thin man named Aldous Pruitt, who had the look of someone who had long ago made his peace with other people's unpleasant paperwork. He looked up when they came in, registered Aurelia with the careful neutrality of a man who knew who she was and wasn't going to let that change how he did his job. Mrs. Wrenford, he said. Mr. Pruitt, I need to file a formal complaint of livestock fraud and financial misconduct against an employee. She set the documentation on his counter. I have delivery records, invoice discrepancies, and a physical cattle count prepared by my senior hand. I'd like this dated and filed today. Pruitt looked at the documentation. He opened Chet's notebook. He spent several minutes going through it, with the quiet attention of a man who understood numbers, and when he looked up, his expression had shifted slightly. This is substantial, he said. Yes. I'll need to notify the Territory Marshal's office. A complaint of this scope. He paused. It's going to generate attention, Mrs. Wrenford. I expect it will. He looked at her for a moment. Dorian Vexley's name is going to come up. I expect that too, she said. Pruitt looked at her for another moment. Then he took the first document from the pile and began preparing the filing. They were walking back to the wagon when Tom Baxter came out of the cattle exchange across the street. He saw them at the same moment Hollis saw him. The three of them stood there for one suspended second, Tom on the boardwalk, Aurelia and Hollis beside the wagon. And in that second, everything that had been moving underground for 3 weeks came to the surface all at once. Tom's face went through several things very quickly. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been anger but resolved into a careful blankness. He crossed the street. Mrs. Wrenford, he touched his hat. Didn't expect to see you in town today. I had business to attend to. Her voice was perfectly ordinary. Did you get the supplies sorted? Working on it. His eyes moved to Hollis, briefly, then back. Anything I can help with while I'm here? No, she said. I think everything is in hand. We'll see you back at the ranch this evening. Tom looked at her for a moment, nodded Hollis at her. And something in his look was the look of a man running numbers and not liking the result. Of course, he said. He touched his hat again and walked back across the street, and Hollis helped Aurelia up onto the wagon bench and climbed up himself and clicked the horse forward, and neither of them said anything until Red Willow was 2 miles behind them. Then Aurelia said, he knows. Yes, he'll tell Vexley tonight. Probably. Hollis kept his eyes on the road, which means we need to think about what happens tomorrow. She was quiet for the rest of the drive. What happened was not tomorrow. What happened was that night. The storm came in faster than anyone expected, rolling down from the north with the particular ferocity of a Montana November storm that had been building pressure for a week and finally ran out of patience. By 8 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the wind was doing things to the ranch buildings that made the lanterns in the cottage shudder on their hooks. Hollis was awake. He'd been awake most of the night anyway, listening to the storm and thinking about Tom Baxter's face in Red Willow, and what a man in his position would do with one night to work with. He was still dressed. He'd told his children to stay in their beds when the storm started, and they'd both been asleep by 9, or at least Maisie. Tobin was harder to read in the dark, but his breathing was slow and regular, and Hollis decided to let him have that. He heard the horses before he smelled it. Not the wind, something under the wind. A sound that was wrong. He was at the window before he'd finished processing what the sound was, and when he saw the orange glow coming from the direction of the main barn, his body was already moving toward the door. He ran. The barn was not fully ablaze yet. One end of it, the hay storage end, had caught, and the fire was working its way along the dry timber wall with the focused appetite of fire that had been given good material and a wind to help it. The horses inside were screaming. He hit the barn doors running and got them open. The smoke was immediate and thick and wrong-smelling. Not just burning hay, but something sharper underneath it, something that didn't belong in a barn fire, and he pulled his neckerchief up over his nose and went in. The nearest stalls. He went to those first 2 of the draft horses, big animals panicking against their gates, and he got the latches open and slapped them toward the door, and they went, nearly knocking him down. Next stall. Next. The spotted mare was in the 3rd stall, and she was in full panic, throwing herself sideways. And Hollis got her gate open, and she came out like a shot, and caught him across the shoulder on her way past, and he went into the wall hard enough to lose his footing. He got up. The smoke was worse now. He could hear voices outside ranch hands, someone shouting, the sound of more people arriving, and he counted stalls against the stalls he still needed to reach and pulled his shirt up higher over his face. Pearl was in the last stall on the left, the oldest stall nearest the fire. He found her by sound, the specific quality of her distress, which even in that chaos he recognized because he'd been in the barn with her every day for 3 weeks. She was pressed into the far corner of her stall, and she wasn't throwing herself at the walls, which was worse, actually. The animals that went quiet in fires had often given up. He got the latch. She didn't move. Come on, he said, or tried to say, through the smoke and the cloth over his face. Pearl, come on. He got a hand on her halter and pulled, and she resisted for one terrible moment, and then she came stumbling, shaking, following the pressure of his hand, because at some deep animal level, she had learned in the past weeks that the pressure of his hand meant safety, and that was the only navigable thing in a world that was entirely wrong. He got her out of the barn and into the yard. She stood there in the snow and the wind, and shook from ears to tail, and Hollis let himself lean against her side for one moment, just one before someone grabbed his arm. It was Aurelia. She was in her coat and boots, with her hair loose, and her face lit orange by the fire, and she looked at him with an expression that was too complicated to read in that light and that moment. She was already organizing. He could see it, in how she was positioned, half toward him and half toward the yard where the ranch hands were gathered. Is anyone still inside, she said. I don't think so. I went through all the stalls. The breeding horses. Out. All of them. I don't know where they went. He straightened. We need to keep the fire from jumping to the equipment shed. Chet's already. I know, come on. They worked for 2 hours. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't coordinated in the way that looked impressive from the outside. It was cold and dark, and everyone's eyes were streaming from the smoke, and half the hands were half trashed because they'd come from the bunkhouse on no warning, and the wind kept doing unpredictable things to the fire's direction. 3 times Hollis thought they had a line of control, and 3 times the wind shifted and they had to move. Aurelia was everywhere. He kept finding her in places he didn't expect, directing 2 hands with a water bucket line, helping Chet shift a supply wagon out of the fire's path, talking to a young hand who had gone still, and panicked looking in the way of someone whose body had stopped listening to their brain. She put her hand on the boy's arm and said something to him specifically, and he unstuck and went back to work. They saved the equipment shed. They saved the secondary structure. The main barn was a loss. The entire hay storage end was gone by midnight, and the rest of the structure too compromised to keep. But the animals were out, and the other buildings were standing, and when the fire finally ran out of material around 2 in the morning, Hollis sat down in the snow beside the water trough and breathed. Aurelia sat down beside him, which he hadn't expected. They sat there together in the dark and the cold for a while, watching the last of the fire die to embers. And neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything useful to say yet. Then Aurelia said, "That wasn't an accident." "No," Hollis said. "It wasn't." "The smell, lamp oil," he said. "On the hay, I think. On the south wall." He'd known it going in, that wrong chemical smell under the wood smoke. Someone said it deliberately. She was quiet for a moment. Tom, or someone Tom directed. He looked at the smoldering remains of the barn. It's a message. Or it was meant to be a more complete disaster, and the wind didn't cooperate. She said, if the breeding horses had been lost, the ranch's value dropped significantly, enough to make the financial position look worse than it already appears from the false debts. She absorbed that. And if it looks like I can't manage, if there's a significant financial loss, a fire that destroys my best stock, then the pressure to sell or accept help gets harder to resist. He paused. Or that's the theory. She looked at the embers. He miscalculated. He didn't get the horses. No. She said it with a quiet fierceness that had nothing performative in it. He didn't. They sat for another minute. Then Hollis said, "I need to check on my children." She put her hand on his arm before he could stand. And it wasn't a romantic gesture. It was the gesture of someone who needed him to hold still for one more moment. "The compartment in the south wall," she said. When Chet was pulling supplies out of the path of the fire, he found something in the equipment shed, a hidden compartment behind the feed shelving. She paused. He pulled it out before the fire reached that area. Hollis looked at her. "Papers," she said. "Ledgers, receipts, what looked like debt instruments." Chet only had time to grab the box they were in. "He has it in the bunkhouse." He thought about what kind of papers Tom Baxter would hide in a wall behind feed shelving. "In the morning," he said. "Yes." She took her hand from his arm. "Go check on your children." Maisie was awake when he got back to the cottage. She was sitting up in bed with the blanket pulled around her shoulders, and Tobin was beside her. And when Hollis came through the door, she said, very quietly, "Pearl?" "Pearl's fine," he said. "All the horses are fine." She let out a breath that sounded like it had been waiting for 2 hours. Tobin looked at his father's face. "How bad?" "The barn's gone. Everything else is standing." He sat down on the edge of Maisie's bed. He was aware that he smelled like smoke and that his shoulder was doing something painful where the spotted mare had caught him on the way out. "Neither of you left the cottage?" "No," Tobin said. "I wanted to, you didn't." Maisie was scared. Maisie said with dignity, "I was not scared. I was worried about Pearl." "Thank you for staying," Hollis said. He looked at them both, his son with his jaw set like a man's, his daughter with her blanket around her shoulders and her hair in 2 loose braids. He felt the weight of the night and what it meant, and what could have happened if the fire had been in a different building, or if someone had decided to send a message through a more direct channel. He had let them stay at Golden Briar because he'd believed the risk was manageable. He'd told himself he could see trouble coming in time to move them out of its way. He sat with that for a moment. "Papa," Tobin said. "What happened?" "Really, someone set the fire. The cottage was very quiet." "On purpose," Maisie said. Not a question. "On purpose," he confirmed. Maisie thought about this. "Because of Mrs. Wrenford?" because of people who want her ranch and thought this would push her closer to giving it up. Maisie pulled her blanket tighter. That's very mean. Yes, Hollis said, it is. Another silence. The wind was still working at the corners of the cottage. Are we going to leave? Tobin asked. Hollis had been asking himself that question since he'd sat down beside the water trough in the snow. He'd been running it from every angle he could find, looking for the one that resolved cleanly. It didn't resolve cleanly. I don't know yet, he said. Tobin said, Mrs. Wrenford needs, I know what she needs. He looked at his son. I'm also thinking about what you need. We're fine, Papa. You don't always get a vote on that. Tobin was quiet for a moment. Then Pearl needed you tonight. You went in for her. Hollis said nothing. You went in because Maisie loves that horse, Tobin said. You went in even though the barn was on fire. He looked at his father steadily. We're going to be okay because you make sure we're okay. You don't have to choose between that and helping Mrs. Wrenford, 11 years old. Hollis looked at his son for a moment. Go to sleep, he said, both of you. He sat with them until Maisie's breathing evened out. Then he went to the table and sat in the dark for a long time. The box that Chet had pulled from the hidden compartment contained 4 ledger books and a bundle of papers tied with cord. Hollis and Chet and Aurelia sat around the kitchen table the next morning while the smell of wood smoke still hung over the yard and went through the contents with the care of people who understood that what they were holding was either very important or carefully constructed to look important. The ledger books were Goldenbrier's accounts, not the official ones that Aurelia kept at her desk, but a parallel set. Someone had been keeping a shadow account of Goldenbrier's finances for at least 3 years, tracking the discrepancies between what the ranch actually held and what its falsified records showed. But more than that, the papers were dead instruments. Hollis spread them on the table and read through them and felt the shape of what he was looking at become clear with a cold, slow clarity. These are forgeries, he said. Aurelia looked at him. Debt claims against Goldenbrier. He laid 3 of them side by side. Signed with your name and notarized. Supply debts, infrastructure loans, feed advances. He looked up, none of which you signed. She looked at the signatures. Her face did something complicated and then went still. My husband's attorney handled our estate matters after he died, she said slowly. The notary stamps. She looked at the name on the stamp. Harold Fitch. He notarized documents for us during the estate settlement. Is Fitch connected to Vexley? I don't know. Her voice had gone flat in the way of someone controlling a response that wanted to be something larger. But these are not my signature. Chet had picked up one of the documents and was looking at it. Total of these debt claims, he said, doing the arithmetic in his head. We're looking at enough to put Goldenbrier underwater. If these were presented to a territorial court as legitimate debts, the ranch would have to be liquidated to cover them. Aurelia finished. She was looking at the papers with an expression that was moving from shock towards something harder and more focused. And whoever purchased the land at auction would get it for a fraction of what it's worth, Hollis said, because every legitimate buyer would be scared off by the debt liability. He paused. Every buyer, except someone who already knew the debts, were fraudulent. The kitchen was very quiet, Aurelia said Dorian. He finances the thefts through Tom, creates the appearance of financial distress, files false debt claims against the property. The ranch looks like it's failing from the outside. It would look like I'd mismanaged it. She stopped, and then he steps in as the obvious solution. Buy the property at auction, or, if I'm desperate enough, accept his marriage arrangement, because it's the only way to keep from losing everything. She stood up from the table. She walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking at the burned shell of the barn that was just visible across the yard. Hollis watched her. He watched her take in all of it, the 3 years of systematic theft, the forged debts, the fire, the calculated patience of a man who had been willing to play a long game because he was confident in the outcome, and he watched her process it and come out the other side of it, not in pieces, but in something harder than she'd been before. She turned around. I need to go back to the county office, she said. Today, with these. She looked at the documents on the table. And I need someone who knows territorial law. There's an attorney in Billings named Harlan Cross. He handles land fraud cases. My husband used him once. Billings is 2 days' ride, Chet said. I know it is. She looked at Hollis. I need you to go. Today. He looked at the documents. You should send Chet. He's the one who found I need Chet here. If Tom comes back today, she stopped. I don't know what Tom will do when he finds out the filing happened yesterday and the fire didn't accomplish what he needed it to accomplish. I need someone steady here. Hollis thought about his children, about leaving them here while he rode to Billings with documents that Dorian Vexley would very much prefer did not arrive at an attorney's office. Tobin appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at his father's face and then at the papers on the table. Go, Tobin said. Hollis said, You don't know what. We're fine, Papa. Chet's here. Mrs. Wrenford is here. He said it steadily. Go. Aurelia looked at the boy and then at Hollis. She didn't add to it. She let the silence hold what Tobin had said. Hollis stood up. I'll need one of your better horses. Mine's still not fit for a hard ride. Take the bay, Aurelia said. She's fast and she knows the road to Billings. I'll leave within the hour. He went to the cottage and changed his shirt and his coat and came back to find that Clara had wrapped food in cloth and put it in his saddlebag, and Macy was standing in the yard, with her arms crossed like she was physically holding herself from making a scene. He crouched down in front of her. I'll be back in 4 days. 4 days is a long time, I know. Pearl will miss you. Pearl will have you, he said. That's better. Maisie's mouth did something complicated. You should be careful, she said in the severe tone of a 7-year-old who had decided to be practical about her feelings. I will be. She threw her arms around his neck for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stepped back and folded her arms again and looked at the ground. He stood up. Aurelia was on the porch. The attorney's name is Harlan Cross, she said. Tell him Aurelia Wrenford sent you. Tell him it's urgent. Tell him she stopped. Tell him everything, he said. He looked at her for a moment. He wanted to say something, but the something that wanted to be said had too many parts, and none of them were appropriate to say in a yard with his children watching and Chet standing nearby in a situation that was already more complicated than it should be. He said, I'll be back. She said, I know. He rode out. Tom Baxter came back to Golden Briar that afternoon. Chet told him the barn was gone. Tom expressed appropriate shock and dismay and asked the right questions in the right order. How had it started? Were the animals safe? Had anyone been hurt? And his performance was good enough that a man who didn't know what Chet knew would have found it convincing. Chet let him perform. He watched Tom's eyes move across the yard and take inventory. Hollis's cottage with smoke from the chimney indicating the children were inside. The equipment shed with its supply box gone. The bunkhouse. Tom didn't ask where Hollis was. That was the thing Chet noted. He asked about the hands and about the animals and about the structural damage. But he didn't ask where the new man was. And the absence of that question was its own answer. Chet went about his afternoon work and said nothing. Around supper time, Tom knocked on Aurelia's door. She let him in. She sat at her desk, calm, and she listened to him tell her that the fire was a tragedy, and that he was deeply sorry, and that he thought they should discuss the ranch's financial position given this additional loss. He had papers with him. Debt claims, he said. Obligations that had come due, that he'd been managing, that he hadn't wanted to burden her with, but given the current situation. She looked at the papers he put on her desk. She looked at them for a long moment. They were different from the ones in the hidden box. These were older, or made to look older. Different debts, different amounts, but with the same false structure underneath them. She said, Tom, have you ever met an attorney named Harlan Cross? He went very still. He practices in Billings, she said. He specializes in territorial land fraud. I understand he's quite good at identifying forged debt instruments. She looked up from the papers. I thought you might know him, since you seem to know a good deal about debt documentation. Tom's face did several things in quick succession. Mrs. Wrenford, he said, and his voice had shifted, something harder showing through the surface. You should go, she said. Take your things from the bunkhouse and go tonight. If you come back, I'll have the marshal meet you. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. He took his papers from her desk. He walked to the door. He stopped there. Vexley isn't going to stop, he said. He said it without warmth, without threat, exactly, more like information being delivered out of some complicated reflex toward honesty at the end. He doesn't stop. I know, Aurelia said, neither do I. Tom walked out. She listened to his boots on the porch steps, then the yard, then the distance until she couldn't hear them anymore. She sat at her desk in the lamplight and she breathed. Just breathed. Her hands were flat on the desk, and she made herself look at what was on the desk. Not the false papers Tom had left, which she would deal with, but the real documents, Chet's notebook, the delivery records from Billings, The box from the hidden compartment. The evidence of what she'd built and what someone had tried to take from her and what she was not going to let them have. Outside, Maisie's voice carried from the direction of the paddock. She was talking to Pearl in the evening cold, probably telling the horse something important about the stars. Aurelia sat and listened to the child's voice in the yard, and she thought about a man riding 2 days through November toward Billings with papers that could end this. And she thought about how strange it was that the thing most likely to save Golden Briar had arrived at her fence line hungry and out of options and unwilling to ask for anything except honest work. She thought about what she owed the world for that particular strange gift. And then she picked up the false debt papers Tom had left and began making a list of everything she needed to document about them. Because Hollis would be back in 4 days, and she intended to have everything ready. Hollis made Billings in a day and a half. He pushed the bay hard on the first day, reading the sky and the temperature, and deciding that the weather he could see building to the northwest was going to make the decision for him, if he didn't make it himself. He rode until the light gave out completely, and then made a rough camp near a creek crossing, ate what Clara had packed, and was back on the horse before the sun cleared the horizon. It was everything Aurelia had said. She was fast and steady and unbothered by the cold in the way of horses that had been properly conditioned rather than just worked. He talked to her a little on the second morning, which was something he did with horses but rarely admitted to. And she flicked an ear back at him in the manner of an animal that was listening without making a point of it. Harlan Cross had an office above a dry goods store on the main street of Billings, accessible by an staircase that had been repaired recently, and not quite well enough. Hollis climbed it on a gray Tuesday morning and knocked. The man who opened the door was somewhere in his late 50s, with the build of someone who had once been physically substantial and had redistributed that substance over the years without entirely losing it. He had ink on his left hand and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the expression of a man interrupted in the middle of something he considered important. "Harlan Cross?" Hollis said. "Who's asking? My name is Hollis Fenwick. Aurelia Wrenford sent me from Red Willow. She said to tell you it's urgent." Cross looked at him for a moment, taking in the travel-worn coat, the hard riding evident in his posture, the oilcloth package under his arm. He stepped back. "Come in." Cross read through the documents without speaking for a long time. He read the way attorneys read, not for the story but for the structure, looking at each piece in relation to the others, building the architecture of it. He asked 2 questions while he read. Just 2, and both of them were precise. When he finished, he set the documents down and looked at the window for a moment. "The notary stamps," he said. "Harold Fitch. You know him?" "I know of him. He lost his notary license in 1887 for irregularities in an estate filing." He said it flatly, which means anyone who used his stamp after that date was either ignorant of his status or aware of it, and using it because a compromised notary is easier to direct. Hollis thought about that. Vexley would know. A man in Vexley's position would know. Cross tapped one of the forged debt instruments. "These are well-constructed forgeries, not amateur work. Someone with access to legitimate documents used them as templates." He looked at Hollis. "How long has Tom Baxter been at Golden Briar?" 7 years, according to Mrs. Wrenford. 7 years is enough time to accumulate authentic document samples. Enough time to understand the ranch's financial patterns, the names of legitimate creditors, the structure of how debt sets were recorded. He picked up one of the ledger books from the hidden compartment. Whoever kept these shadow accounts understood ranch finances at a detailed level. Tom managed the accounts after her husband died. Then Tom had everything he needed. Cross set the ledger down. What Mrs. Wrenford filed at the county office yesterday. The livestock fraud complaint. That's a starting point, but it addresses the theft without reaching the fraud. These documents, he touched the forged debt papers. These are federal territory offenses. Forged instruments filed against property is a criminal matter that goes above a county clerk. Hollis said, "What does she need to do?" "What she's already doing, mostly. Continue documenting. Don't destroy anything. Don't confront Vexley directly." He paused. "And I need to ride back with you. To Red Willow. I need to examine the original filing at the county office. And I need to take sworn statements from your senior hand and from anyone else who can speak to what they witnessed." He was already moving toward a cabinet along the wall. "Vexley is going to respond to the county filing. He'll have his own attorney move to challenge it, probably within the week once he hears it was filed. We need to be ahead of that." He already knows, Hollis said. Tom saw us at the county office. He would have told Vexley that night. Cross stopped, looked at him. Then we have less time than I'd prefer. That seems to be a recurring feature of this situation. The attorney almost smiled. Not quite. How soon can you ride? Hour, Hollis said. I need to get the horse fed and rested. 2 hours, Cross said. I need to pull files and arrange my absence. He looked at Hollis again with the careful attention of a man who was adjusting his assessment of someone. You rode a day and a half through November to bring those documents here. Yes, you're not a relative of Mrs. Wrenford's. No, you're a hired hand, temporarily, Hollis said. Cross looked at him for another moment. Get your horse fed, he said, and went to pull his files. They made Red Willow in 2 days, pushing harder than was comfortable and speaking less than two men riding together usually did, which suited Hollis fine, because he spent most of the ride thinking about what he was going to find when he got back. He had not let himself think too specifically about his children during the ride out to Billings. He'd locked that particular door because there was nothing useful in opening it while he was 2 days away and couldn't do anything about whatever he imagined. But on the ride back, with Cross beside him and the familiar terrain starting to appear, he let himself think about Tobin and Maisie and what it meant that he'd left them behind in a situation that had already produced a deliberately set barn fire. He'd left because Aurelia asked him to, and because the documents needed to reach Cross, and because he'd made a judgment call. He was still not entirely sure the judgment had been right. He thought about what Tobin had said, "We're fine, Papa. Go." 11 years old and carrying that much steadiness. Hollis wasn't sure if that was something to be proud of or something to feel guilty about, or if those two things were just the same thing seen from different sides. They arrived at Golden Briar on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after he'd left. The first thing he saw in the yard was Maisie, who appeared to have been watching the road, because she was running toward them before the horses had stopped moving. He got down and she hit him at speed, wrapped both arms around his middle and pressed her face into his coat, and he put his hand on the back of her head and stood there for a moment. Pearl's been sad, she said into his coat. I'll go see her directly. I told her you were coming back. She didn't believe me. A pause. She believes me now. He looked up. Tobin was standing on the porch with his arms folded in what Hollis recognized as his son's version of trying to look casual. Behind him, Aurelia appeared in the doorway. She looked at Hollis, then at Cross, then back at Hollis. Something in her face that she didn't let become what it wanted to be. You made good time, she said. The bay's fast, he said. This is Harlan Cross. Cross dismounted and removed his hat. Mrs. Wrenford. Your husband used my services in '84, if you remember. I remember, she said. Come inside. Cross spent 2 hours at Aurelia's desk with the documents, and then another hour with Chet, who gave his account of the delivery records and the cattle count and the hidden compartment with the careful precision of a man who understood that accuracy mattered more than drama. Hollis was in the barn with his horses during this. For his horses and Pearl, who had indeed been neglected over the past 4 days in the sense that she had received adequate feed and care from the other hands, but no extended one-sided conversations, which she appeared to consider a significant deficit. He worked through the stalls and thought about nothing in particular, and let the barn do what barns did, which was provide a space where the noise of everything else got smaller. He was brushing out gray when Aurelia came in. She didn't say anything for a moment. She stood near the stall door and watched him work, which she'd done from the beginning, and he'd stopped finding it uncomfortable somewhere around day 10. Cross thinks we're in a strong position, she said. I know. He told me on the ride back. He's going to the county office in the morning to examine the original filing, and then he wants to take depositions. She paused. He thinks Vexley will move to challenge the livestock fraud complaint within the week. He wants to be prepared. He'll be prepared, Hollis said. He's thorough. She was quiet for a moment. Tom hasn't come back. I didn't think he would. No. Another pause. Dorian came, though. Yesterday. He stopped brushing, looked at her. He came alone, she said. No escort. He knocked on the front door like a social call. Her voice was dry. He told me he'd heard about the fire and the livestock complaint, and he wanted me to know he was concerned. That a woman managing a property of this size alone was vulnerable to exactly these kinds of difficulties. Hollis waited. He said he'd spoken with his attorney and that the debt claims against Golden Briar were a matter of public record, implying they were legitimate, and that he was prepared to assume those debts if I was willing to discuss terms. She folded her arms. He was very pleasant about it, very reasonable. What did you tell him? I told him the debt claims were under legal examination and that I'd have to ask him to speak to my attorney. She paused. He didn't like that. I expect he didn't. He said something about how he hoped I wasn't being influenced by outside opinions about what was in my best interest. She looked at Gray, who was watching her with his ears forward in the relaxed way he'd developed over the past weeks. He meant you. Hollis went back to brushing. I know. He's going to make that argument more formally, she said. That I've been improperly advised by a man with a financial interest in the outcome. Hollis said nothing. It's not true, she said, obviously. But it's the kind of thing that sounds plausible to people who want it to be plausible. She looked at him. I wanted you to know he's going to try that angle. I understand. He set down the brush. It might be better if I might. Don't, she said. Don't say that, Aurelia. The name came out before he'd made a decision about it. She noticed. He could see she noticed, but she didn't react to it. If you leave now, she said, it looks like exactly what he wants it to look like. A man who came, influenced the situation in his favor, and left when it became inconvenient. She kept her voice level. It also leaves me without my best hand during a rebuild after losing the barn, which is a practical problem entirely separate from the legal one. He picked up the brush again. I'm not sure my being here is worth the complication it creates for you. That's my calculation to make. She said it without heat. Not yours. He worked in silence for a moment. Gray exhaled contentedly and dropped his head. The first night, Hollis said, finally, when you asked if we'd eaten. She waited. I almost said no to supper. She looked at him. I know. I could see you deciding. What changed your mind, he said. Then not you. Me. What changed my mind? He thought about it honestly. Maisie's face, he said. She was trying so hard not to look at your kitchen. And I thought even if everything else about this situation is wrong, she has a right to a warm meal. Aurelia was quiet. I've been making decisions based on what's safe for a long time, he said. Safe means we keep moving. Safe means I don't let anybody close enough to matter. Safe means, he paused. It means a lot of cold nights and a lot of hunger, and my children learning to pretend they're fine when they're not. She was watching him with that full attention of hers. This stopped feeling like a temporary situation somewhere around day 12, he said. That's the honest answer. I stayed for the work, and then I stayed because walking away from it felt wrong. He looked at the horse. I'm not sure what to do with that. I'm not sure either, she said. But I don't think the answer is for you to leave. He looked at her. I think the answer is that we handle what's in front of us, she said. And then we see. He nodded. It wasn't resolution. But it was honest. And honest was what both of them seemed to manage better than anything smoother. Bexley's attorney filed a motion challenging the livestock fraud complaint 4 days later, exactly as Cross had predicted. The motion argued that the complaint was based on misinterpreted records and that the discrepancy in cattle numbers was attributable to standard livestock movement that hadn't been properly documented. In other words, that the missing cattle weren't stolen, just poorly tracked. It also raised, in careful legal language, the question of whether the complaint had been filed under the influence of interested parties who stood to benefit from action against Golden Briar's management. Cross read the motion at Aurelia's desk with the expression of a man who had seen this particular argument structured this way before. He's not wrong that it'll create doubt, Cross said. Judges in territorial cases tend to be cautious about property disputes when the amounts are significant. Bexley's attorney is good. What do we need? Aurelia said. Tom Baxter. Cross set down the motion. Baxter ran the operation on the ground. Bexley can claim ignorance of the theft, that he was financing a business arrangement he believed to be legitimate. Without Baxter's testimony connecting the two, Bexley walks away from the criminal end of it. Tom's gone, Chet said. He was standing near the door, where he'd been for the duration of this conversation. Gone doesn't mean unreachable. Cross looked at Hollis. You track cattle brands across 3 pastures. Can you track a man who left on foot with his possessions 4 days ago? Hollis said, where would he go? Somewhere he feels safe, Chet said slowly. He's got a sister in Miles City. Mentioned her once or twice over the years. Cross nodded. Miles City is within Territory Marshal's jurisdiction. You'd need the marshal to move on it, Hollis said. The marshal's office will move if I give them grounds. Cross looked at the filing in front of him. And the forged debt instruments are grounds. That's federal territory fraud. That's not a civil complaint that Bexley's attorney can manage into a quiet settlement. He paused. But I need to put all of it together first. The instruments, the shadow ledgers, the cattle count, the delivery records, and a sworn statement from Mrs. Wrenford about the signatures. How long? Aurelia said. A week. Maybe 10 days. She looked at the window. Outside, the yard was gray and cold. The space where the barn had been still raw and obvious. All right, she said. It took 9 days. 9 days of Cross at the desk, and Chet providing sworn statements, and Aurelia going through the forged documents one more time, and then one more time again, with the careful attention of a woman who understood that getting this right once was more important than getting it fast. Hollis rebuilt a temporary structure where the barn had been, not a full replacement that would wait for spring, but something sufficient to shelter the horses through the worst of the winter. He worked with 2 of the remaining hands and Tobin, who showed up every morning with the same wordless readiness he'd shown since the beginning, and they got walls and a roof up in 5 days that was ugly and functional and would hold. He worked and he waited and he watched the road. On the 6th day, Maisie informed him that she intended to learn to ride Pearl in the spring, and that she had already discussed this with Pearl, and Pearl was in agreement. Pearl expressed an opinion on the matter, Hollis said. She nodded, Maisie said. Horses don't nod. Pearl does. It's very slight. You have to know her. She said this with the authority of someone who considered the conversation settled. You'll teach me? He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, and absolutely certain of what she wanted, which was something her mother had also been, though he was choosing not to follow that thought to where it went. In the spring, he said.
Yes. She accepted this with dignity and went back to Pearl, and Hollis went back to the temporary barn wall he was framing, and he thought,
We're still here. Still here is something. The marshal's deputy arrived at Red Willow on the 9th morning. His name was Callum Reed, and he had the compact, unhurried manner of a man who'd been doing this work long enough to stop being theatrical about it. He met with Cross in Aurelia's front room for 2 hours, going through the documentation with his own methodical thoroughness, and when he came out, he had the look of a man who'd arrived skeptical and was leaving with a different assessment. He went first to the county office, where the complaint was on file. Then he went to the holding yard south of Red Willow that Denny had mentioned, which still held cattle 41 head, still wearing their Golden Briar brand unaltered, apparently waiting for a rebranding operation that had not yet taken place. 41 head still carrying Aurelia's brand. That single fact did more than all the ledger books combined. Reed sent a rider to Miles City that afternoon. Tom Baxter was brought back to Red Willow on a Thursday 6 days later, in the company of 2 deputy marshals. He looked different from how Hollis remembered him. Smaller, maybe, without the authority of the ranch behind him. He'd been at his sister's house in Miles City. Chet had been right about that, and he hadn't run further because either he'd convinced himself he wasn't in criminal danger, or he'd simply run out of money and nerve at the same distance. He was taken to the county building, not the jail. This was still the interview stage. Cross explained to Aurelia, and the distinction mattered legally, and Cross met with Reed there for most of the morning, while Aurelia waited at Golden Briar, with her hands folded on her desk, and her face giving away nothing. Hollis stayed close, not because she asked him to, because it seemed like the right thing to do. At midday, Cross returned. He came into the front room and sat down across from Aurelia and looked at her with the measured expression of a man delivering news that was good but complicated. He's talking, Cross said. Aurelia said nothing. He's talking because his attorney who Vexley arranged for him, which is its own problem, for Vexley told him that cooperation was his only path to any kind of leniency. Cross set his hat on his knee, and because when Reed showed him the 41 head in the holding yard, still bearing your brand, the story Baxter had been preparing about misinterpreted records stopped being a story he could tell. What is he saying? Aurelia said. That Vexley approached him 3 years ago. That the original arrangement was for Tom to identify opportunities, weaknesses in the ranch's operation, financial pressures, that kind of thing, and report to Vexley. He paused. That it grew from there. The feed invoice inflation was Vexley's instruction: use the difference to fund the operation and create the appearance of ongoing costs. The cattle removal was more recent, started about 18 months ago, and the plan was to rebrand and sell them through Vexley's stockyard contacts in Wyoming. And the forged debts. Tom provided the document templates. He had access to your husband's original debt instruments from the estate settlement. He doesn't know who produced the forgeries themselves. He says a man in Billings. Reed is looking into that now. He paused and Harold Fitch the notary. Aurelia was very still. Fitch is in his 70s and living with his daughter in Helena, Cross said. Tom says Vexley had something on Fitch from the 87 estate irregularity. Threatened to expose it to the licensing board, what was left of his reputation, if Fitch didn't provide stamps. So he used an already compromised man to do the forgeries, Aurelia said, and made sure the risk was layered. Tom, Fitch, the man in Billings, none of them knew the full scope of what the others were doing. Cross looked at her steadily. Vexley is careful. He always has layers between himself and the action. But Tom's testimony connects him directly. To the cattle operation, yes. To the financial scheme, yes. He paused. To the fire, Tom says he didn't set it and doesn't know who did. He says Vexley told him it was being handled and he didn't ask how. The room was quiet. That's the one piece Reed can't nail to Vexley directly right now, Cross said. Tom didn't do it and doesn't know who did. Hollis said, the wrong-smelling accelerant. If someone can identify what it was, Cross looked at him. Reed has someone looking at what remains of the structure, but it's been weeks. In this weather, he shook his head. We may not get that particular connection. Aurelia said, does it matter? If the livestock fraud and the forged documents are established. For the criminal case, probably not. For the full picture, Cross paused. The fire complicates the public narrative. Vexley's attorney will argue that Tom or someone else acted independently, that Vexley had no knowledge of it, and that the fraud charge is separate from any act of destruction. He looked at her. He'll take the fraud if he has to. He'll fight to distance himself from the fire. She nodded slowly. What happens now? Reed files criminal charges against Tom Baxter for livestock theft and fraud. The Territory Marshal's office opens a formal investigation into Vexley based on Baxter's testimony. He set his hat back on his head. And I file to void the fraudulent debt instruments against Golden Briar, which is a civil matter that will run parallel to the criminal one. How long for the civil filing? Weeks, potentially. Months if Vexley contests it hard. She looked at the desk. And during that time, the debt claims are still technically on record. Yes. Though I can file for a hold on any action against the property while the fraud question is being litigated. He paused. I'll do that today. That's the most important immediate step. She nodded. Mrs. Wrenford. Cross leaned forward slightly. You should understand that Vexley will not take this quietly. He has resources, and he will use them. His attorney will attack the credibility of every witness, including your hired hands, including Mr. Fenwick. He said Hollis's name without looking at him. He will use every available avenue to create doubt. I know, she said. And it may take a year, possibly longer. I know that too. She looked at him directly. Is our position solid? Cross considered it honestly. Solid enough, he said. Not unassailable. Nothing is unassailable in a territory proceeding with a man of Vexley's connections. But solid. Then we proceed, she said. Vexley came to Red Willow 3 days after Tom's testimony became known. He didn't come to Golden Briar this time. He went to the cattle exchange, and he sat at a table near the window, and he met with ranchers and businessmen through the course of the day, one after another, with the patient deliberateness of a man rebuilding a wall. Hollis heard this from Chet, who had a friend who worked at the exchange, and he thought about it for most of that evening. The next morning, he went into Red Willow himself. He didn't have a specific plan. That was the honest truth of it. He went because sitting at Golden Briar waiting for the legal machinery to turn felt like the wrong response to a man who was currently working every social angle available to him. And because sometimes the right thing to do was simply to be visible in the places where you were being discussed. He went to the general store first, legitimate errand supplies Aurelia needed. While he was loading the wagon, 2 ranchers he didn't know came out of the building across the street and looked at him in the deliberate way of men who had been given a description and were confirming it matched. He finished loading the wagon. One of them crossed the street. Big man, somewhere in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd been ranching this territory for a long time. You're Fenwick, he said. That's right. I'm Walt Osgood. I've got property about 8 miles east of Golden Briar. He said it like he was establishing credentials. I've known Dorian Vexley for 15 years. Hollis waited. He says you've been feeding Mrs. Wrenford stories about his business practices, that you've been working her toward a legal action you figured would benefit you personally. Hollis looked at him. What would that benefit be, exactly? Osgood paused. He hadn't expected the question asked that directly. He implies you might be positioned to acquire an interest in the property. I'm a hired hand, Hollis said. I earn $1.50 a day. I came to Golden Briar with $11 and a lame horse. Whatever interest I have in that property, it's the interest of a man who doesn't want to watch a woman be systematically robbed by people she trusted. Osgood looked at him for a long moment. The cattle are in a holding yard south of town, Hollis said. 41 head, still branded with Mrs. Wrenford's mark. The marshal's deputy saw them himself. That's not a story I told anyone. That's cattle in a yard. The rancher was quiet. The feed invoices go back 20 months, Hollis continued. The forged debt instruments have a compromised notary's stamp on them. A man who lost his license in 1887. Tom Baxter is giving testimony to the marshal's office right now. He picked up the last bag of supplies and set it in the wagon. Whatever Dorian Vexley told you about my motives, I'd ask you to weigh it against what the physical evidence is showing. Osgood looked at the wagon. At the supplies, ordinary ranch supplies, nothing extravagant. Vexley's been a useful man in this territory, he said, but it came out differently than it would have 5 minutes earlier. I expect he has been, Hollis said. Useful to himself, anyway. He picked up the reins. Good morning, Mr. Osgood. He drove back to Golden Briar. He told Aurelia about it that evening. She listened, and then she said, Osgood's opinion matters in this county. He has standing with the other landowners. I know. I wasn't trying to recruit him. He stopped. I was tired of Vexley telling that story without anyone pushing back on it. She looked at him. What did he say when you were done? Nothing much. He just looked at the wagon. She was quiet for a moment. Walt Osgood has a dead wife and a daughter who runs his household. He's a practical man. She paused. A man who came to town for basic ranch supplies is a different story than a man who came to town angling for a wealthy widow's property. Hollis hadn't thought of it in those terms. He'd just been loading flour and salt and rope. It matters, she said. What people see. He thought about the first night arriving at her fence line with a cracked wagon wheel and 2 hungry children, fixing the gap without being asked. What she'd seen. What she'd done with what she'd seen. Yes, he said, I suppose it does. She stood up from the desk. She walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking at the yard, at the temporary structure that had replaced the barn, at the cold November dark. I've been thinking, she said, about what happens after this, after the legal proceedings, whatever the outcome. He waited. Golden Briar needs a horse operation, she said. A real one, not what we had before. The horses we have now, Gray, the spotted mare, the others. There's the start of something, not a continuation of something. She turned around. That requires someone who knows what they're doing with frightened animals and has the patience to do it slowly. He said nothing. I'm offering you the position permanently, she said. Foreman of the horse operation. Your own wage, properly calculated, not $1.50 for temporary work. A real position. She paused. The cottage is yours for as long as you want it. He looked at her for a long moment. She said, You don't have to answer now. I know. He stood. He picked up his hat. Aurelia. She looked at him. I need to think about it. He said it carefully, honestly. Not because I don't want to stay. Because I need the wanting to stay to be the right kind of reason. She held his gaze. That's a fair answer. I'll give you a real answer in a few days. He went to the door. He stopped there. The children are happy here, he said. Maisie's teaching Pearl to nod. Tobin's talking about horses the way he used to talk about horses, back when we had them. He paused. I haven't seen him like that in a long time. She didn't say anything. That matters to me, he said. More than I can explain in a way that doesn't sound like sentimentality. It doesn't sound like sentimentality, she said quietly. He put on his hat and went out into the cold. He stood in the yard for a moment. Above the temporary barn, the stars were very clear, the way they got in Montana when the temperature dropped hard enough to clean the air of everything else. He thought about $11 and a lame horse, and the look on Tobin's face when they'd pulled up to this ranch that first evening. He thought about Maisie and bread. He thought about 4 years of keeping things small enough to survive. He thought about the shape of a life built on survival versus the shape of one built on something else. He went to the cottage. He checked on his children, both asleep. He sat at the small table in the lamplight for a long while. He thought, I came here because they were hungry. He thought, I am still here because something else grew up around that. He thought about whether a man had a right to let something grow, given everything he'd already lost. given all the ways he'd been careful, and how careful had turned out to be its own kind of damage. He sat there long enough for the lamp to burn low. Then he went to bed. And in the morning, before the sun came up, he was already in the barn with Gray. And Gray's ear was tipped back toward him in the easy way of an animal that had learned that this particular human's presence meant nothing bad was coming. And Hollis stood there in the quiet and the cold and thought, this is a thing I built. This trust, this animal's ease, this particular small good thing. He thought, I can build more of those. He thought, I think I'm going to stay. He told her in the morning, not with a speech. He wasn't built for speeches, and she would have seen through one anyway. He came to the ranch house before breakfast, knocked on the front room door the way he always did, and when she looked up from the desk where she'd already been working for an hour, he said, I'll take the position. She looked at him for a moment. Permanently, he added, because he wanted to be clear about what kind of answer he was giving. I know what permanently means, she said. I know you do. She looked back at the desk. Wage is $2 a day. The cottage is yours at no rent. That's part of the position, not charity. So don't argue with me about it. She picked up her pen. You can start by telling me what we need to rebuild the horse operation properly. He almost smiled. Good morning to you too. Good morning, Hollis. She said it without looking up. Close the door on your way out. It's cold. He closed the door. He stood on the porch for a moment in the early light, and he thought, all right then. He went to the barn and started work. The Territory Marshal's formal investigation into Dorian Vexley opened in December, 3 weeks after Tom Baxter's testimony. It was not fast. It was not clean. It moved the way legal proceedings moved in 1000. 889 Montana through paper and rides and depositions and the slow accumulation of documented fact against a man who had spent considerable money, ensuring that accumulated facts were difficult to assemble. Vexley's attorney was good, as Cross had said, and he worked every available angle, challenging the credibility of the cattle count, arguing that Tom's testimony was self-interested, filing motions that required Cross to respond and respond again. Cross responded every time. He was patient in a way that Hollis came to respect. Not the patience of someone waiting for something to happen, but the patience of someone building something stone by stone and content to let the building take as long as it took. Hollis kept working. That was the part nobody wrote down, the part between the dramatic moments, the daily maintenance of a life that was in the middle of being rebuilt. He managed the horse operation and oversaw the barn reconstruction and handled the morning decisions that a ranch generated in quantity, whether or not there was a legal proceeding underway. Chet was his right hand, and they settled into a working relationship that functioned well precisely because neither of them felt the need to perform it. Tobin worked beside him every morning, before school, and every afternoon after. And Hollis watched his son develop the specific competence that comes not from instruction but from doing. The way his hands learned the horses, the way he started reading an animal's mood from 20 yards, the way he began making small decisions independently and getting them right more often than not. He didn't say much about it to Tobin. He just let it happen. Maisie, true to her word, began her riding education in early spring, when the ground was soft enough and Pearl had spent enough winter being talked to, that she would stand without complaint for anything Maisie wanted to do with or near her. The lessons were not formal. They were Hollis holding Pearl's lead and Maisie on her back, walking in circles around the paddock with the intense concentration of a child committed to mastery, and Pearl walking with the patient dignity of an animal who had decided this was acceptable. She's good, Aurelia said one afternoon, watching from the fence. She's fearless, Hollis said, which is different. Is that a problem? Depends on what she does with it. He watched Maisie ask Pearl for a slightly faster walk, and Pearl oblige, and the grin on his daughter's face. I don't think it'll be a problem. Aurelia leaned on the fence rail. She told Clara she's going to breed horses when she grows up. She told me she's going to train them. I think there might be a negotiation coming. Aurelia looked at him sideways. Between you and her? Between her and herself. He watched his daughter ride. She'll figure out what she wants. They stood at the fence together for a while without speaking, which had become a thing they did with some regularity, not filling silence for the sake of filling it. He'd noticed that about her early on and found it unusual, and then found it necessary, the way some things become necessary without your noticing the transition. The civil judgment on the fraudulent debt instruments came in April. Cross brought the paperwork out to Goldenbrier himself, which told Hollis the news before Cross opened his mouth. An attorney who delivered bad news usually delivered it from his office, where there were walls around it. Cross sat at Aurelia's desk and laid out the ruling. The territorial court had voided all 6 fraudulent debt instruments filed against Golden Briar. The ruling found that the documents bore forged signatures and compromised notarization, and that they had been created with the intent to defraud. The fraudulent debts were struck from record. Additionally, 41 head of cattle recovered from the holding yard south of Red Willow were confirmed as Golden Briar property and returned. 16 additional head were identified through brand registry comparisons and recovered from a Wyoming stockyard where they had already been sold. The buyer, a legitimate rancher who hadn't known their provenance, was compensated through a separate claim against the estate of the scheme, which was a complicated way of saying Vexley's assets were being inventoried. Tom Baxter was sentenced to 3 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge. His cooperation had reduced the sentence from what it might have been, but cooperation had its limits when you'd been stealing from a widow for 20 months. Harold Fitch, the compromised notary, was 81 years old and in poor health, and the territory chose not to prosecute him directly. His daughter sent a letter to Aurelia through Cross that was 2 pages long and written in the shaking hand of a woman who needed the person she was apologizing to understand that she hadn't known, that her father had been frightened, that she was sorry. Aurelia wrote back. She kept the letter short and said she understood that frightened people did things they shouldn't, and that she wished the old man peace. Hollis read neither letter, but Aurelia told him about them, and he thought about it for a while. The specific kind of grace it took to write something like that to the family of a man who'd helped forge your financial ruin. He thought about what kind of person did that. He thought he probably already knew. Dorian Vexley was a more complicated matter, the criminal case. The one that would have put Vexley personally in front of a territorial judge on fraud charges did not result in a conviction. Cross was honest about this, and Hollis respected him for it. Tom Baxter's testimony established that Vexley had directed the scheme, but Vexley's attorney successfully argued that the chain of evidence was mediated, that everything between Vexley and the actual criminal acts passed through Tom, and that Tom's testimony as a convicted man seeking reduced sentencing was inherently self-interested. The criminal case was dismissed for insufficient direct evidence. Vexley walked out of the proceeding in Billings on a Wednesday morning and did not go to prison. Hollis was in the barn when Aurelia came to tell him. He kept working for a moment after she finished. Then he set down the tool in his hand. "Is Cross going to appeal?" he said. "He says the grounds are thin." She was leaning against the stall door. Her voice was even. "He says the civil judgment is solid. The fraudulent debts are voided. The cattle are returned. The financial damage is documented and on record. But the criminal case needed direct evidence that Vexley arranged to put enough distance between himself and the action to make him possible. So he loses the civil case and loses the criminal case and goes home. He loses 41 cattle, the civil judgment, and his reputation in this territory." She paused. Cross says 3 of the ranchers Vexley had been meeting with at the cattle exchange have quietly declined to renew business arrangements with him. Hollis thought about Walt Osgood, looking at a wagon full of flour and salt and rope. "That matters," he said. "It does." She looked at Gray in the adjacent stall. "It's not everything I wanted. I wanted him to face a judge for what he did. I know. It still bothers me." She said it plainly, without pretending it didn't. "I want you to know that I'm not at peace with it. You don't have to be at peace with it." He looked at her. "You can be angry about it and still move forward. Those aren't the same thing." She held his gaze for a moment. "When did you figure that out?" He thought about Wyoming. About a summer that didn't end the way it was supposed to. About 4 years of moving forward, while being angry about things he couldn't change. Slowly, he said, and badly. But eventually, she was quiet for a moment. "Vexley's going to sell his eastern properties," she said. Cross heard it from the county office. "He's pulling out of this territory, moving his interests to the Dakotas." She paused. "He has enough money to start again somewhere else. That's the honest truth of it. I know. And Golden Briar is whole. The debts are gone. The cattle are back." She looked at the barn. The real barn now, rebuilt through the winter, tight and properly framed and smelling of new wood and clean hay. The ranches. She stopped. He waited. "I keep looking at it like I'm expecting it to still be damaged," she said. "Like I haven't adjusted yet to it being—" She seemed to look for the word. "Ours again." He looked at her. She caught herself. Mine, she said. Mine again. He didn't correct her. He bought the land in August. 12 acres adjoining Goldenbrier's eastern boundary, a parcel that had come available when one of the smaller ranchers in the area consolidated and sold off what he didn't need. The price was fair and the land was good, and Hollis had saved enough from 8 months at $2 a day, plus the wages he'd set aside carefully for the 2 years before that, to make the purchase without borrowing. He did not tell Aurelia about it until after the deed was signed. He did not tell his children either, which was harder because Tobin had eyes that missed very little, and Maisie had a habit of asking direct questions at inconvenient moments. But he managed it, and when the deed was in his hand, he sat with it for 2 days before he knew what to do with it. What he did was wait for an ordinary evening, not a significant one, not a night that had already been shaped by anything important, just a regular Tuesday in September, warm enough still for the last of the summer, when Aurelia had invited the 3 of them to supper, as she did several times a week, and Clara had made a roast, and Tobin was arguing with Maisie about something that had been escalating since the ride over, and resolved itself, as their arguments usually did inconclusively, with both parties deciding the other was wrong and moving on. Hollis waited until the meal was mostly finished, and Clara had gone to the kitchen, and Tobin had gotten up to carry dishes, which was something he'd started doing without being asked about 3 months ago. He put the deed on the table. Aurelia looked at it. Maisie looked at it. Then at her father, then back at it. "What is that, a deed?" Hollis said. "To what land?" 12 acres on the east side of this property. Maisie's face went through several things. "Our land? My land." She thought about this. "Where are you going to put a house?" "I haven't decided yet." She thought some more. "Can I have a paddock for Pearl? Near the house?" "Maisie," he said. She subsided. Tobin had come back from the kitchen and was reading the room in the way he'd always read rooms, picking up the weight of things without being told what they weighed. Hollis looked at Aurelia. She was looking at the deed with an expression that was working very hard to be unreadable and not quite succeeding. "The first night we came here," he said, "I stayed because my children were hungry." He kept his voice steady. "I want you to know what tonight is different from." She looked up. "Tonight I own enough land to feed them myself," he said. "That's what I needed. For you to know that." He paused. "I am not here because I need what you have. I'm not staying because the alternative is worse." He looked at her directly. "I'm staying because I want to be exactly where I am." The room was quiet. Maisie, who had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of a child who understood more than adults generally gave her credit for, said, "Does this mean I can call you Mama Aurelia?" Aurelia made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something that wasn't a laugh, and she pressed one hand over her mouth for a moment. Tobin closed his eyes briefly. "Maisie, what?" "I've been waiting to ask for months." "Papa said to wait." She looked at her father. "You said when the time was right." "I said don't ask until it was the right moment." She gestured at the room. "This is the right moment. Papa just said very nice things and everyone is feeling emotional." She looked at Aurelia. "Can I?" Aurelia lowered her hand from her mouth. Her eyes were bright. "Yes," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "You can." Maisie sat back with the satisfaction of someone who had been patient for a very long time and had been proven correct to wait. Tobin looked at the ceiling. Hollis looked at Aurelia, and she looked at him, and there was no gesture between them, no dramatic crossing of space. Just 2 people looking at each other across a table covered with supper dishes and a property deed and the evidence of an ordinary evening, and understanding what the other was saying without either of them having to say it. They married the following spring in the front meadow of Goldenbrier. It was not a large event. Chet was there, and Clara and Cross, who rode out from Billings and seemed genuinely pleased about it, in the way of a man who'd helped build the conditions for something, and was content to see it come out well. Walt Osgood came, which surprised Hollis, and brought his daughter, and shook Hollis's hand with the grip of a man who had changed his assessment of someone and was willing to show it. Tobin stood beside his father in a new shirt and looked like someone who had decided not to cry and was going to succeed at it through sheer stubbornness. Maisie stood beside Aurelia and cried immediately and without apology, and when the short ceremony was finished, she took both of their hands and said, "Now we're a family," with the conclusive authority of someone announcing a fact rather than expressing a hope. "We were already a family," Hollis said. "We were a family that wasn't official," Maisie said. "Now we're official." He couldn't argue with that. There are things that nobody tells you about rebuilding a life that has come apart. They don't tell you how long it takes. Not weeks, years. Not a single moment of recovery, but a long, irregular process that has good days and days when you wake up still carrying the weight of what was lost, and days when you forget to carry it for a while. And slowly, the forgetting days outnumber the rest. Nobody tells you that the people who help you rebuild are rarely who you expected, that it's not usually the grand gesture or the dramatic rescue. It's someone asking, "Have you eaten?" and meaning it, and waiting for the honest answer. It's someone handing you a ledger and saying, "Sit down, because I need someone who knows what they're looking at." It's someone saying your place isn't beneath anyone, in a barn, in the cold, when you needed to hear it more than you had the language to admit. Nobody tells you that pride has a price, and the price is usually paid by the people standing closest to you. Hollis thought about that sometimes, about all the years of being careful, all the ways he'd kept his children at a careful distance from dependency, all the cold nights that were the cost of his determination not to need anything from anyone. He'd called it dignity. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was just fear wearing dignity's clothes, and the difference mattered, and it took him a long time to learn which was which. His children knew things about hardship that children shouldn't have to know. That was true, and it would always be true. But they also knew that their father had not broken, that he had gotten up in the mornings and found work and protected them as best a person could with the tools available to him. That mattered too. You could hold both those things. Aurelia knew something different about loss, the specific hollowness of a house full of furniture and silence, of grief that gets quieter but not smaller, of powerful men who look at a woman's solitude and see an opportunity. She knew what it cost to stand in front of that and refuse to flinch over and over for years when nobody was watching and there was no applause for the refusal. She'd been refusing before Hollis arrived. That was important. He hadn't rescued her. The legal proceedings hadn't rescued her. She had spent years building the kind of person who could survive what Vexley tried to do to her, and that person was already in place when a cowboy with a cracked wagon wheel showed up at her fence line in November. What they gave each other wasn't rescue, it was company. The specific relief of not being alone in the thing you were doing anyway. That's its own kind of love. And it's maybe the most durable kind, not the love that arrives like a solution to a problem, but the love that grows up in the middle of ordinary life, beside the water trough, and in the ledger books, and in the barn at 5 in the morning, with a horse that's learning to trust again. The horse operation at Golden Briar grew into something neither of them had planned exactly, but both of them had worked toward. By the second year of Hollis's management, they had 30 horses on the property working stock and breeding animals, and the small group of difficult cases that seemed to find their way to Golden Briar the way strays find a place that doesn't turn them away. He had a reputation now, which was strange to him still, not Aurelia Wrenford's husband, though he was that, but Hollis Fenwick, who could work a frightened horse, who had patience that other men didn't have, who could take an animal that had been written off and find out what was still good in it. He thought sometimes about what that reputation was built on. It was built on the same thing everything, in his life that had turned out right, was built on the refusal to write something off before you'd actually looked at it. The gray gelding, who'd become one of the best working horses on the property. The spotted mare who'd foaled twice and turned out to have excellent bloodlines once she was handled properly. Pearl, who was 16 years old and still standing at the paddock fence waiting for Maisie to come and tell her things. Tobin was 19 when he started managing the southern pastures independently, and 20 when he told his father he was thinking about starting a small breeding operation of his own, eventually, when he had enough put together. Hollis said, "What kind of horses?" And Tobin spent 45 minutes explaining exactly what kind, with the detailed specificity of a young man who had been turning this over in his mind for a long time. And Hollis listened with the attention he'd given Aurelia's questions in the barn, in those early weeks like the information mattered. Like the person delivering it deserved to be heard completely. When Tobin finished, Hollis said, "The Halverson parcel on the north side might come available next year. Worth thinking about." Tobin looked at him for a moment, with an expression that Hollis recognized because he'd worn it himself, the expression of someone being given room to be something, and not being entirely sure what to do with that much space. "Yeah," Tobin said after a moment. "Worth thinking about." Maisie went the direction that had always been obvious to anyone paying attention. She ran the injured and unwanted horse program. which started as an informal arrangement and became something with structure and regular intake and a waiting list of animals from ranches across 3 counties that had horses they couldn't handle and didn't know what to do with. She was 22 and fierce and relentless, and occasionally drove Hollis to distraction by acquiring horses they had no immediate room for, on the grounds that they had nowhere else to go. "You sound like your mother," he told her once, meaning Aurelia, which Maisie had been calling Mama for 4 years by then, and Maisie said, "Good," without any hesitation, and went back to what she was doing. He stood there for a moment after that and thought about the specific shape of what had grown here, in this place, on this land. He thought about a gap in a fence in November, and 2 children pretending they weren't hungry, and a woman on horseback who had asked the right question at the right moment and meant it. He thought about all the ways it could have gone differently, all the nights he'd almost left, all the moments he'd been wrong about things and had to adjust, all the ways Aurelia was not the woman he'd initially categorized her as, and all the ways he'd turned out not to be what he'd told himself he was either. He thought, we built something here, not perfectly, not without cost, but something real. One evening in the late fall, several years after the spring wedding in the front meadow, Hollis came back late from checking the east herd. The temperature had dropped hard after sundown, and the stars were doing that thing they did in Montana when the cold cleaned the air sharp and very close. The way they'd been the night he'd sat on the porch after telling Aurelia he'd take the position permanently and wondered what he'd decided and whether it was right. He knew now. He'd known for a while. He rode into the yard and could hear from inside the house the sound of supper in progress, Tobin's voice, and Maisie's voice arguing about something with the specific energy of a disagreement that had been going on for a while and was not going to resolve itself in the next 5 minutes. Through the kitchen window, the light was warm and yellow, and Clara was visible moving past the glass. And somewhere in the house, Aurelia was present in the way she was always present, in the specific quality the house had when she was in it that was different from when she wasn't. He put the horse up. He stood in the yard for a moment. He thought about $11 and a lame horse and a wagon with a cracked wheel. He thought about a boy who'd carried hay before breakfast without being asked, and a girl who'd been thinking about bread since Tuesday. He thought about frozen fence rails and a woman asking, "Have you eaten?" and meaning it, and the specific weight of that meaning in a moment when it had been a long time since anyone had meant anything toward him simply. He thought about all the ways the world could wear a person down the droughts and the debts, and the people who looked at someone's necessity and saw an angle. He thought about how you kept going anyway, not because it was easy or because you were certain it would come right, but because the alternative was stopping, and stopping was the only real defeat. He thought, I came here because my children were hungry. He thought, I stayed because I found out who I was when someone gave me the room to be it. He walked to the house. Aurelia was in the doorway before he got there, not waiting, exactly, because she wasn't the type to wait in a doorway, but present in it, like she'd heard the horse come in and had come to see. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him for years now. Not like a woman looking at a man who'd solved a problem for her, but like a woman looking at someone she'd chosen, which was its own kind of thing. You're late, she said. East fence needed checking. Tobin said he'd do it in the morning. I was already out there. He climbed the porch steps. Is there supper left? There is. She moved back to let him in. Maisie and Tobin are fighting about the north paddock again. Who's winning? Nobody, as usual. She paused. Chet stopped by. He says the Halverson parcel is going on the market in March. Hollis stopped, looked at her. I told him we knew, she said, that Tobin was already thinking about it. And Chet said if Tobin needs a reference letter for the land office, he'd write one. She said it simply, the way she said things that mattered simply, without decorating them. He said, Tobin's the best young horseman he's seen in this territory. Hollis stood in the doorway for a moment. He thought about a boy who'd carried hay before breakfast at 11 years old because he understood, without being told, that this was a place worth working for. He thought about what it meant to watch someone become something. I'll tell him, he said. He came inside. The noise of the house wrapped around him. Tobin's voice from the kitchen. Maisie's response, Clara, saying something that neither of them was listening to, the fire in the hearth, the smell of the meal, the particular living sound of a house with people in it who were not being careful with each other. Aurelia came in behind him and closed the door against the cold. And Hollis Fenwick, who had arrived at this place with empty pockets and 2 hungry children, and the careful, battered dignity of a man who'd learned not to need anything from anyone stood in the warmth and the noise and thought, this is what I was trying to get back to. All those years of keeping things small enough to survive. This is what I was keeping myself for. He hadn't known it then. He knew it now. That was enough. He went to the table and sat down and came home.